I'll never forget that moment my mother handcuffed right before our eyes. The same woman who once read me poetry, who lulled me to sleep, now stood trembling under police lights. I used to believe she was everything, the one who sacrificed all after my father died. Then I discovered she secretly spent nearly $500,000 my father left for us, alongside her lover, my father's best friend. They traveled the world on that money while we grew up struggling, drowning in debt and lies. If you think this is just another ordinary family story, you're wrong. Don't forget to subscribe to catch even more haunting stories from us. Isabelle Torres stood in the center of her sunlit studio, brush still trembling between her slender fingers, staring at the massive canvas that dominated the far wall. The paint was barely dry, the deep cobalt and dusky rose swirling into a somber ballet that felt almost too intimate to share. Outside Portland's rain-slick streets glistened under the early morning haze, cars hissing by like restless ghosts. Her heart pounded, equal parts triumph and dread. This was the piece that would travel to New York for her first solo exhibition, a milestone she'd dreamed of since sketching half-finished flowers in the margins of her childhood notebooks. She set the brush down carefully, exhaled, then crossed to her battered drafting table, where an old leather album lay half open, its pages worn thin from countless revisits. She didn't even realize her hand was trembling until her fingers brushed the first photograph, a snapshot of her at maybe 5 years old, gap-toothed and wild-haired, sitting in the dusty backyard with a half-eaten popsicle. In the corner of the frame stood her mother, Marlene, one hand shading her eyes from the sun, the other clutching Isabelle's baby brother Thomas by the shoulder. Her mother's smile was bright, almost blinding, but her eyes, Isabelle had always thought, never quite matched. They carried a sadness that seemed older than her years. A breath caught in Isabelle's throat. God, she had spent so long believing that expression was grief, that it was the permanent echo of losing her husband, Isabelle's father, to a sudden stroke in the middle of an unremarkable Tuesday afternoon when Isabelle was just 9. They'd been eating grilled cheese sandwiches in the kitchen, Marlene humming some half-remembered tune as she diced tomatoes. Her father had laughed at something Thomas babbled. Then his face collapsed, his hand clutching his chest, and he was gone before Marlene even reached the phone. The memory was so sharp it still cut her from the inside out. She flipped to the next page, tracing the cracked plastic sleeve that encased a school portrait, hers at age 11. Her hair was too short. Marlene had chopped it at the kitchen sink to save money. Isabelle remembered blinking back tears while Marlene muttered, "It's just hair, honey. It'll grow back. We can't afford the salon right now." The money always seemed just beyond reach. New clothes were hand-me-downs from church donations. School lunches were reduced fee. Vacations were an alien concept. Isabelle's art supplies, precious beyond measure, were mostly cast-offs from library clearance bins or gifted by sympathetic teachers who recognized her raw talent. But Marlene was the rock. The iron-spined matriarch who made sure dinner was hot every night, who took on extra shifts cleaning office buildings after her receptionist job so Isabelle and her siblings could have second-hand winter coats. Isabelle used to lie awake at night listening to the front door squeak open close to midnight, her mother's sigh drifting through the dark house as she slipped off battered sneakers. "Sleep, my little birds," Marlene would whisper if she thought they were still awake. "Tomorrow we start again." Isabelle felt the sting of tears in her eyes now. She'd painted this latest canvas with those memories humming in her veins, her mother's quiet strength, the taste of instant oatmeal on chill winter mornings, the threadbare throw blanket that had once been her father's favorite. The painting was meant to honor them, to honor her. She pulled up a stool, cradled the album on her knees. The next page was a collage Marlene had assembled from bits of life receipts from school fees, a crumpled ticket stub from a county fair, a faded grocery list where Marlene had scribbled in the margin, "Remember milk for Isabelle's cereal." That small line gutted her. How hard had her mother fought to keep them from feeling the edge of poverty, to make sure there was always enough somehow even when there wasn't. And yet under the warmth of all those moments, a seed of something uneasy stirred in Isabelle's gut. It was the same feeling that had haunted her for years, tiny fractures in the story that never quite healed. Why had Marlene been so adamant they couldn't afford art classes for Isabelle, yet somehow scraped together funds for Thomas's soccer fees? Why did Isabelle remember hushed phone calls late at night, Marlene's voice sharp and low as if slicing something invisible to ribbons? Why had her mother looked almost startled the day a letter arrived from a local foundation offering a modest scholarship for underprivileged youth with exceptional artistic promise. A letter Marlene had snatched and tucked into her purse with a brittle smile before Isabelle could read more than a line. Isabelle snapped the album closed, hugging it to her chest like a shield. A sudden gust of Portland wind rattled the window panes as if to jolt her from the spiraling maze of old wounds. This was not the time to dig up questions best left buried. She had a show to prepare for, contracts to finalize, a dream clawed together through sleepless nights and thousands of sketches. And still, despite every rational argument, she couldn't silence the ghost of her father's voice from that one final summer afternoon. "Izzy, promise me you'll always live honest. Don't let the world make you small. And take care of each other no matter what." No matter what. It sounded so simple back then, spoken over the smell of cut grass and barbecue smoke, her mother laughing nearby with a neighbor. Isabelle had carried that promise like a talisman through every hardship, every exhibit rejection, every time she'd watched Marlene grow smaller under the weight of the world. And now, standing on the cusp of everything she'd worked for, Isabelle wanted more than anything to look at her mother and still see that same steadfast protector. She wiped her cheeks, ignoring the smear of blue paint her fingers left behind. In 2 days, she'd board a flight to New York. She'd call Marlene tonight, invite her to come along, show her the bustling galleries and bright city streets she deserved to see after a lifetime of sacrifice. They'd toast cheap champagne in a tiny Manhattan hotel room and promise each other this was just the beginning. Because it had to be. Isabelle refused to believe their story could be anything but a testament to resilience, to family, to the quiet, enduring love of a mother who'd given up her own happiness so her children could have a chance. Outside, the rain intensified, drumming against the studio windows in urgent staccato. Isabelle turned back to the canvas, taking in its brooding colors that seemed now to whisper of something else, something she couldn't yet name. She exhaled slowly, picked up her brush again and dipped it into the deep crimson. Then with a steady hand, she laid a bold new line across the heart of her painting, unaware it was the first stroke in a story about to unravel everything she thought she knew. Isabelle awoke the next morning to the sound of her phone buzzing insistently on the nightstand. Sunlight streamed through the gauzy curtains of her small Portland apartment, painting pale stripes across the tangled sheets. With a groggy sigh, she reached over, expecting some spam offer or another reminder from her online art supply cart that she'd abandoned weeks ago, but the screen glowed with a new email notification, subject line crisp, almost formal invitation, solo exhibition opportunity, Manhattan Arts Collective. For a full 10 seconds, her breath stopped. Then she scrambled upright, nearly knocking her coffee mug from the windowsill. Her heart roared in her ears as she tapped the message open. It was real. A well-respected curator had seen her latest portfolio online, loved her use of color and emotional undercurrents, and wanted to feature her in a fall showcase in New York City. They'd pay a stipend for travel, offer 3 weeks of wall space, and even hinted at possible private buyers. Isabelle's hands shook so violently she had to set the phone down on her thigh to keep from dropping it. This was the break she'd been clawing toward for years, the reason for every gig painting, restaurant murals on tight deadlines, every children's birthday caricature she'd squeezed in to make rent. Her mind raced with possibilities, stomach fluttering so hard she thought she might be sick. New York, her name on a gallery card, people actually paying to stand in front of her work and feel something. Then, almost reflexively, her thoughts jumped to her mother. Marlene had been the silent architect behind every moment of this. The countless times she'd said, "Go ahead, Isabelle, buy the better brushes. I'll figure out how to cover the groceries this month. Or don't worry about me, sweetheart. Just keep painting. That's what your father would have wanted." A tender ache bloomed in Isabelle's chest. Maybe this was the perfect way to repay Marlene, not just financially, though. Of course, one day she dreamed of buying her mother a cozy little house by the sea, but emotionally. A way to honor all those sleepless years, Marlene worked double shifts to make sure Isabelle had a sketchbook under her arm and a warm bed to sleep in. Maybe they could go together. Isabelle pictured it so vividly her eyes stung, the two of them in some quaint hotel off Fifth Avenue, sharing tiny pastries from a corner bakery wandering Central Park with paper cups of hot chocolate. It would be more than a trip. It would be a thank you, a celebration of how far they'd come. She grabbed her laptop, still open on the side table, and started pulling up airline options. Flights, she realized, meant passports. Isabelle hadn't traveled further than Seattle in almost a decade, and last she checked her passport had expired. She padded barefoot across the small apartment to her filing cabinet, rifling through drawers stuffed with old exhibition contracts, tax returns, and scattered invoices. When she tugged open the bottom drawer, a battered manila folder fell out. It was so thick with paper its seams had started to split. Across the top in neat blue ink, someone had labeled it Family Documents. Isabelle sank to the floor, folder balanced on her knees. She thumbed through the contents idly, her birth certificate yellowed, school vaccination records for Thomas and Emma, faded Polaroids from camping trips. She smiled sadly at a shot of her father holding up a trout he'd caught, Marlene standing beside him, with a hesitant grin, almost as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to be happy. Then something else caught her eye. Near the bottom, buried under old insurance paperwork, was an envelope far newer than the rest. Heavy cream stock, embossed with the name of a local law firm she recognized from commercials, Davison and Reed. Her brow furrowed. She turned it over, saw it had already been sliced open, then carefully withdrew the contents. A 3-page document slid into her lap. As her eyes skimmed the header, the words seemed to punch all the air from her lungs. Declaration of Trust, Charles E. Torres Grantor. Beneficiaries, Isabelle Torres, Thomas Torres, Emma Torres. Initial funding, $486,000 USD. Her pulse crashed in her ears. She scanned line after line, mouth dry, reading how her father had set up a trust just months before he died, specifically for the education, health, and welfare of his 3 children. Isabelle's vision wavered. Her father, who'd left the house on a warm June morning and never returned, had tried to protect them from exactly what happened next: years of scraped-together rent, discount groceries, tearful nights when Marlene said, "We're doing the best we can, honey. Money's always tight when you're on your own." A date at the bottom of the statement snagged her attention. Withdrawals had begun less than a year after his funeral. Regular, steady thousands at a time. Isabelle's breath turned shallow. The last recorded balance, according to a statement from just 3 years ago, was under $18,000. Her hands trembled as she flipped to the next page: signatures, bank routing numbers, quarterly reports with Marlene's careful initials on every line item. Her mother hadn't just known. She had controlled it. Suddenly the room seemed smaller, darker. The gentle Portland rain outside felt like a mocking applause. Isabelle's mind reeled back through time, desperately grasping for explanations. All those nights Marlene sobbed at the kitchen table, Isabelle assuming it was grief. The consistent deflection whenever she asked about college money. Scholarships are best, sweetheart. Loans build character. Or Thomas's freshman year when he had to drop out halfway through because we just can't afford another tuition bill. Had it all been a lie? Isabelle clutched the papers to her chest, curling forward until her forehead touched her knees. A nauseating guilt crawled up her throat. Guilt for every time she'd felt resentful when Marlene refused to co-sign a modest line of credit. Guilt for every unspoken question she'd swallowed to keep the peace. God, Mom, was it ever actually hard for you? Or did you just let us believe it was so we wouldn't ask too many questions? The email on her phone pinged again, a gentle nudge from a stranger across the country who believed in her talent. It should have been the happiest day of her life. Instead, she sat on her worn hardwood floor surrounded by dusty folders and wondered if anything she believed about her family was real. For a flicker of a second, she almost wished she hadn't opened that envelope. Almost. Because underneath the dizzying ache, something cold and sharp rooted itself in her belly, a hunger to know. To drag every hidden secret into the light, no matter how ugly it might be. Isabelle pushed herself upright. Her legs were weak, her hands still trembling, but her eyes held a dark clarity. Tonight, she would call Marlene, not to invite her along, not yet, but to start asking questions she should have demanded answers to years ago. Because this exhibition, this future in New York, wouldn't be built on half-truths and shadowy sacrifices. If her mother's halo had cracks, Isabelle was finally ready to see every fracture, no matter how deep it went. Isabelle stood by her studio window long after the sun had disappeared behind Portland's rain-washed rooftops. The document lay splayed open on her drafting table, glaring up at her like a wound that wouldn't close. The words blurred every time she tried to focus, the columns of numbers transforming into little graves of trust she hadn't known to mourn. Her phone sat heavy in her palm. She stared at the screen, thumb hovering. The business card she'd dug out from the manila folder was propped against a jar of turpentine, Gerald Lawson Trust, and estate attorney Davison and Reed, her father's lawyer. The man who'd once come to their modest, clapboard house with solemn eyes and a leather briefcase offering Marlene paperwork and hushed condolences. Isabelle remembered peeking around the corner of the hallway, seeing Marlene nod and sign page after page, her hand shaking slightly, as if the pen weighed 1,000 pounds. Back then, Isabelle thought that grief was the only thing Marlene carried in those shoulders. Now she wondered how much guilt had already begun to bloom there. She pressed the call button before she could talk herself out of it. Each ring felt like an accusation, loud, sharp, echoing in her ribs. When the line finally clicked over, a calm baritone answered Gerald Lawson speaking. For a moment, words completely deserted her. Her throat tightened around something raw. "Mr. Lawson, this is Isabelle Torres, Charles Torres's daughter." A pause. She could almost hear him shuffling papers, searching the drawers of memory for her name. Then warmly, "Isabelle, of course. My goodness, it's been... 20 years? I still remember your father bringing you into my office, little girl in a yellow dress covered in paint. I'm sorry this is unexpected. How can I help you?" The tenderness nearly broke her, but it also steeled her spine. Isabelle swallowed, gripping the edge of the table. "I found paperwork today about a trust my father set up for us, me, my brother, my sister. Nearly $500,000. I wanted to understand what happened to it." A pause. Longer this time. She could hear him breathing, shifting uncomfortably. "Ah, yes, that trust. I haven't heard inquiries on it in a long time." "Because my mother was the trustee," Isabelle pressed. "I see her signatures everywhere. I need you to tell me what she did with the money." Gerald sighed, and it wasn't the officious exhale of a man annoyed by inconvenience. It sounded genuinely pained. "Isabelle, I'd have to pull the full records to be certain. Confidentiality is complicated even with family. But broadly, the funds were largely liquidated over the span of about 13 years. Your mother filed the necessary reports. Stated expenditures were for living costs, educational needs, medical expenses." Isabelle's nails bit into her palm. "Medical expenses. None of us had major health issues." "That's what puzzled me at the time," Gerald admitted carefully. "But your mother maintained full guardianship and fiduciary control, especially while you were minors. Legally, she had broad discretion. She presented receipts, some legitimate, some rather opaque. I did send letters of concern, but she always responded with documentation that at least on the surface seemed to satisfy the trust's loose requirements." Isabelle's chest felt hollow, like her heart had been scooped clean out. "So it's gone." A gentle rustle of paper. Gerald's voice dropped to something close to regret. "Yes, almost entirely depleted. The last statement I have from about 3 years ago showed just under 18,000 remaining, possibly less now. I haven't received updated documents since then." Her knees buckled. Isabelle gripped the edge of her drafting table, feeling the wood dig cruelly into her skin. All those years skipping school dances because they couldn't afford a new dress, turning down art camp scholarships because even travel money was out of reach, rationing groceries, Marlene weeping over the electric bill while telling Isabelle, "It's all we can do to keep the lights on, sweetheart." Rage started as a small, bright pinprick inside her chest. It grew hot and feral until her whole body felt lit from within by something wild. "Mr. Lawson, did you ever suspect she was lying, that she wasn't using the money for us?" There was a heavy silence. Then he said, "I suspected. But legally my hands were tied. Unless a beneficiary formally challenged her use of funds, which of course you and your siblings were too young to do, there was little I could press. Your mother was persuasive. I wish now that I had pushed harder." Isabelle blinked hard. Her tears weren't from sadness anymore. They were fury. Fury at a woman who had stood in the doorway of Isabelle's first tiny studio smiling proudly and said, "You're making your father proud, Izzy, all," while hiding the fact she'd stolen his last gift to them. Her voice trembled but stayed firm. "Thank you for being honest, Mr. Lawson. I might need your help soon, with next steps." "Whatever you need," he said almost fatherly. "And Isabelle, for what it's worth, I think your dad would be very proud of you." She hung up and stood perfectly still in the center of her studio. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the city slick and glistening like a bruise under the streetlights. Her reflection swam in the dark window, a pale ghost, with eyes too wide clutching the phone like it was the only thing tethering her to earth. Slowly, her mind began connecting ugly little dots she'd always ignored. The new refrigerator that had appeared suddenly in their kitchen when she was 15, even though Marlene said they couldn't afford Isabelle's school trip to San Francisco. The way her mother always returned from those overnight cleaning jobs in Salem with a new bracelet or a suspiciously fancy pair of shoes. The guilt that had wormed through Isabelle's gut every time she'd asked for even a modest allowance. Why did I let her make me feel guilty for needing anything? The thought screamed through her skull. Her gaze drifted to the massive canvas by the wall, still damp colors swirling a testament to every struggle, every sacrifice she'd believed was shared. It didn't feel like a monument to resilience anymore. It felt like a shrine to a lie. She sank into the nearest chair, arms wrapped tight around herself, rocking slightly as the truth crashed down. Marlene hadn't been just unlucky, or noble, or tragically overburdened. She'd been a thief, a liar. Someone who could look her own daughter in the eyes year after year and let Isabelle think there was simply never enough when in truth there had been plenty. Plenty for new clothes, for summer camps, for weekends where they didn't have to count every grocery coupon. Her father's last act of love, trying to protect them from exactly this future, had been squandered by the one person Isabelle trusted most in the world. And what now confront Marlene demand what there was nothing left? Not enough money to fix years of pinched hopes? Not enough words to rebuild the fragile faith she'd carried like fine porcelain since she was a girl. Isabelle pulled her knees to her chest, letting her breath come ragged and shallow. Eventually, the rage settled into something darker, a cold, humming resolve. If her mother could spend 15 years hiding the truth, Isabelle could spend as long as it took digging up every rotten piece of it. Because now she needed answers, and more than that, she needed Marlene to see exactly what she'd destroyed. Isabelle sat hunched at her drafting table long after the city outside had sunk into a hushed midnight lull. Her fingers toyed absently with the corner of her sketchbook, an old leather-bound journal she'd used in college margins, still filled with half-finished figure studies and loopy daydream scrawls. Its battered cover should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like some fragile artifact from a simpler time before she'd known just how deep the rot went. She couldn't stop replaying Gerald Lawson's voice in her head. Almost entirely depleted, 12 or 13 years, your mother was persuasive. Each sentence felt like a lead weight tied to her ribs. The studio smelled like linseed and turpentine and stale coffee. Isabelle's newest piece stood abandoned on its easel, glaring back at her with raw reds and sullen indigos that seemed to accuse more than soothe. She couldn't pick up the brush again, not with her hands still trembling, so she reached instead for a different kind of evidence. Her old budget notebooks were stuffed into a shoebox on the bottom shelf, dozens of them from the time she was 15, and Marlene had taught her to keep a record of every penny they spent. "We have to be careful, sweetheart. That's how families survive lean years." Isabelle had taken that to heart almost obsessively. Each page was a ledger of their modest hopes, rent, utility bills, grocery trips, back-to-school shoes. She flipped through year after year of cramped numbers, the slow creep of higher costs, the way Marlene's handwriting always curled dramatically around the word essential when she listed things like insulin for Thomas or a new mattress, when Emma developed back issues from the lumpy hand-me-down. And yet threaded through it all were unexplained absences. Isabelle paused on a page from nearly 14 years ago, the ink a faded blue. March mom away for work, Salem. Expected back in 9 days, paid rent late, skipped art supplies too tight. 9 days. Then later that year, November, mom gone again. Says bookkeeping job in Eugene. 2 weeks, missed Thanksgiving together. She felt her mouth tighten. That was the Thanksgiving Isabelle had burned the stuffing trying to cook it by herself, fighting tears while Thomas and Emma argued in the next room. Marlene had called from the hotel that afternoon, her voice strangely bright. "You're my brave girl, Isabelle. Hold it together for the little ones, okay?" Isabelle had ended that call feeling proud, responsible, grateful her mother was out there working for them. Or so she thought. She paged on. The pattern repeated, always cloaked in practicality. Mom traveling for a contract. Client and Bend wants in-person meetings. Sometimes Isabelle would find small gifts afterward, a new set of oil pastels, a soft wool scarf. She'd cherished them, never daring to wonder how Marlene could afford even those small luxuries when the electric bill still went unpaid. Her eyes blurred and she pressed her knuckles hard into her sockets. How could I have been so stupid? She slammed the notebook closed and stood abruptly, knocking her chair back. The movement startled her enough to let out a small strangled laugh. Anger, grief, humiliation, they all tangled inside her until she couldn't tell them apart. Pacing the length of her studio, she caught sight of her computer still glowing on the side table. Without thinking, she crossed to it and clicked open her browser. The default page was innocuous, some arts forum she usually browsed for critiques, but now it felt too bright, too clean. With mechanical focus, she logged into Facebook. Her mother's profile came up easily, the smiling profile picture of Marlene standing in front of a rosebush. Isabelle's stomach knotted. Marlene's timeline was full of proud reposts of Isabelle's artwork photos of Thomas's small HVAC business van Emma's volunteer days at a local food bank. 1,000 tiny badges of motherhood. Then Isabelle scrolled back, deeper, past birthday collages, past shared dog memes, and memes about wine, past even the years when Facebook auto-tagged photos by face. She found an album dated almost exactly 10 years ago. My dream trip to Paris. Thank you to dear friends for making it happen. Isabelle stared at the cover photo, Marlene on a stone bridge over the Seine, laughing arms thrown wide to embrace the city. A second shot showed her in a little cafe swirling red wine with practiced elegance, eyes half closed as if savoring more than the flavor. Then Notre Dame glowing at dusk. A carousel, a bright gold watch on her wrist Isabelle didn't recognize. Her pulse skittered. Back then, Marlene had explained it with a casual wave of her hand. A friend's husband had hotel points to burn. He insisted I take the room even threw in a plane ticket. It was practically free. You know how that works, Isabelle. She had accepted it without question. Because why would she question Marlene was the woman who skipped lunch so Emma could have an extra sandwich? Who clipped coupons religiously and shook her head at every whim Isabelle ever voiced. It's lovely, honey, but we don't have room for extravagance. And yet here she was smiling under Parisian lamplight cheeks, flushed hair done in soft curls Isabelle had never seen at home. Paid for with what trust money meant to keep her children from exactly the kind of lean, haunted adolescence they'd endured. A low, strangled sound worked its way out of Isabelle's throat. Her hand rose to her mouth. Then she slammed the laptop closed so hard the desk rattled. She spun away, hugging herself. Her mind replayed every time Marlene had looked at her with soft pity. We'll manage somehow, Izzy. We always do. The way Isabelle had admired her grit, her long hours, the way she'd internalized that their struggles were a badge of honor. All those years she felt guilty for wanting anything more than survival. She wanted to tear the room apart. Her eyes darted to her painting, its rich, moody depths now felt obscene. Was every brushstroke a lie paid for with stolen comfort? Isabelle backed into her chair and collapsed, burying her face in her hands. A hot wave of shame flushed through her. How could I have been so easily deceived? How could she let me carry guilt for years, thinking we were hanging on by a thread when she was taking trips halfway across the world? The betrayal was too fresh, too acidic to taste fully. It burned all the way down. She curled forward, forehead against her knees, rocking slightly like she used to as a little girl when night terrors came. Except this time the nightmare wasn't imaginary. It was carefully documented, time-stamped, posted for the world to admire, and it carried her mother's beaming face. She stayed like that a long time while the city outside pressed closer, with every passing hour Portland's hum of distant cars, the soft shush of tires on wet asphalt, an occasional voice drifting up from the sidewalk. Life going on, unaware, unchanged. When Isabelle finally raised her head, her eyes were dry, but something in them had hardened. Whatever came next, whether it ended with tears or lawyers or an explosion of family secrets, she knew she couldn't keep pretending. Because if Marlene could stand in Paris with a wine glass in hand, grinning at sunsets that her children's sacrifices had funded, Isabelle at least deserved to know every cruel detail of how deep the betrayal ran, even if it destroyed them both. Isabelle never imagined she would find herself sitting across from a private investigator, the kind of grizzled man whose lined face and unflinching stare seemed ripped straight from a noir film. But there she was, 3 days after uncovering the trust documents, perched on a cracked leather chair in a cluttered downtown Portland office, her palms slick with sweat. His name was Jack Holland. He looked up from the slim file she'd handed him, brows raised just slightly. Your mother, huh? That's not the usual gig, spouses, business partners, sure. Family, that hits different. Isabelle managed a brittle smile. Believe me, this isn't my idea of normal either. Jack leaned back, interlacing thick fingers behind his head. The blinds were half closed, casting stripes across his salt and pepper hair. You said you've got reason to believe she's misappropriated funds from a trust your late father set up, and you want to know where it all went. She nodded, swallowing the acid in her throat. Not just for me, for my brother and sister too. It's like we grew up thinking we were clawing by on scraps, and now I don't know if anything she ever told us was true. I need to see exactly what's been happening, even if it wrecks me. Jack studied her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly. All right. Paper trail's usually more telling than any confession. I'll start with financials, asset searches, credit lines, property holdings. You signed for full disclosure on your mother, so I'll run with it. Also see if there's been unusual travel activity or companion records. Might take a couple weeks. You sure you're ready for whatever turns up? Isabelle hesitated. Images flashed through her mind. Marlene cradling Isabelle as a feverish child, Marlene's beaming face at Emma's high school graduation, then the Paris photos, the hollow excuses, the tears that might have meant nothing at all. I have to be ready, she whispered, because it's the only way I'll ever be free of wondering. Jack's lips twitched, not quite a smile. Fair enough, I'll be in touch. The waiting was torture. Isabelle spent the next days holed up in her studio, oscillating between frantic bursts of painting and hours where she could only pace hands-fisted mind, spiraling through every worst-case scenario. Each night she collapsed on her couch, only to be jolted awake by dreams of her mother standing on distant beaches, clutching fistfuls of money that dissolved into sand. Then one damp Monday morning, her phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. "It's Jack Holland. You got a minute to come down to the office? I've got some findings you'll want to see in person." Her heart lurched so violently she nearly dropped her phone. Yes, I'll be there in 20. Jack's office seemed somehow darker than before, the late morning light struggling through streaked windows. He didn't waste time on small talk. As Isabelle perched on the edge of the chair, he slid a thick envelope across the desk. "That's copies for you to keep. Digital files are on the flash drive inside, but let me walk you through the highlights." He pulled out several 8x10 photos, spreading them across the desk like grim tarot cards. Isabelle's breath stuttered. There was Marlene, unmistakably elegant, in a tailored linen dress, standing at a balcony railing with a glass of wine. Beyond her, the azure smear of the Amalfi Coast. Another photo showed her laughing at an open-air cafe in Buenos Aires, her hand reaching across the table to grasp the wrist of a man whose face made Isabelle's stomach turn to ice. Alan, her father's oldest friend. The man who had stood next to Charles Torres in every childhood photo of family barbecues and camping trips. The man who used to toss Isabelle into the lake with a booming laugh, promised to keep an eye on your mom for your dad when Charles traveled for business. Jack tapped the photo gently. They've traveled together to at least 8 countries in the last 15 years. That's what my airline contact could piece together. Florence, Buenos Aires, Tokyo, Santorini, Lisbon, Marrakesh, Amalfi, and Paris. Credit card logs show corresponding hotel stays, frequently the same rooms. It paints a pretty clear picture. Isabelle's throat closed. She couldn't force a single word past the lump of horror. She traced her fingers over Alan's smiling face. How many times had she and her siblings sat on his knee as kids? How many birthdays had he come to arms laden with gifts they'd assumed were from the goodness of his heart? Jack cleared his throat almost apologetically. It gets worse. I found wire transfers from your mother's managed account, the same one tied to the trust fund sent directly to a joint account she holds with Alan, spanning over a decade. Some marked as home renovations, some as medical, but none matching actual property work or insurance claims. A low sound ripped from Isabelle's chest. Rage, grief. It came out broken either way. She clutched her temples, pressing until stars burst behind her eyes. Jack went on quietly, as though trying not to startle a wounded animal. This isn't just a woman who mismanaged family funds to keep up appearances. This is deliberate siphoning. She used trust money meant for you 3 to bankroll a Second Life travel luxury, God knows what else, with your father's closest friend. Isabelle slumped forward, breath shaking. A memory smashed into her, Alan standing beside Marlene at her father's funeral, his arm around her shoulders as she wept into his chest. Isabelle had been too small, too consumed by her own loss to register how tightly Alan's hand clutched Marlene's side, or the way he'd whispered to her mother, their heads bent close as though they were already sharing secrets that didn't belong to anyone else. When she finally raised her head, tears streaked silently down her cheeks. Jack pushed a box of tissues toward her eyes, averted with a tactful mercy she appreciated more than she could say. "How did we grow up clipping coupons?" she rasped, counting quarters at the laundromat while she was eating oysters in Venice with my father's best friend. Jack leaned back with a sigh that seemed to carry every weary case he'd ever worked. Some people find the nearest lifeboat when grief hits. Others find comfort or opportunity. Looks like your mother found all 3 rolled into one. The words sliced her to the marrow. She gathered the photos into trembling hands. "You're sure it's all tied back to the trust, not just personal earnings?" Even as she said it, the last scraps of hope shriveled inside her. "Nearly every major withdrawal I could track came from accounts tied to the trust or follow-on investment vehicles seeded by it. I'm sorry, Isabelle. There's no question about whose money funded these trips. Silence thickened the room, broken only by the distant moan of traffic on wet streets below. Isabelle tried to pull her thoughts into some order. Each time she pictured Marlene's familiar smile, her mother's gentle scold, "Izzy, honey, we can't splurge on little luxuries right now. Times are tight." It turned razor sharp, slicing through every childhood reassurance. She squared her shoulders, finally swallowing the bile that rose in her throat. "Thank you, Jack, for being thorough. I need to figure out what to do next." He gave her a long look that was surprisingly kind. "If you decide to pursue legal action, civil or even criminal, I can connect you with some damn good forensic accountants. But whatever you do, take care of yourself first. This kind of betrayal, it breaks people if they aren't careful." Isabelle gathered the photos, the statements, the ugly truth. As she stepped out into the cold drizzle of late afternoon, the sky seemed to mirror her mood, low, heavy weeping for something already long dead. Alan, her mother, her father's last gift turned into a passport for betrayal, but she would unravel every inch of this twisted tapestry, even if it meant burning down the remnants of her family to see it done. Isabelle sat in her car outside her childhood home for nearly half an hour before she could will herself to step out. The dashboard clock ticked forward mercilessly, each minute gnawing at the edges of her resolve. Her hands kept returning to the manila folder on the passenger seat, the one stuffed with printouts from Jack's investigation photos that made her stomach turn bank statements like tiny hammers pounding away at any remaining illusions. She had rehearsed this confrontation over and over in her mind on the drive over. Maybe Marlene would crumble tears streaking her mascara, finally confessing everything with shaking hands. Maybe she'd plead for forgiveness promise to make it right somehow. Maybe, just maybe, Isabelle could still salvage some thread of the woman she had worshipped all her life. But another darker possibility pulsed just beneath that fragile hope. The possibility that her mother would dig in her heels, turn cold and defensive. That she would treat Isabelle like an intruder instead of a daughter. That there would be no apology, no understanding, only a cavern widening between them, bottomless and final. When Isabelle finally climbed the familiar porch steps, the boards gave their usual complaining creak. The door swung open almost instantly, as if Marlene had been standing just behind it. Her mother's face lit up surprise, smoothing quickly into delight. "Isabelle, oh honey, what a nice..." Marlene's voice faltered as her gaze fell to the thick folder clutched tight against Isabelle's chest, her smile dimmed by a cautious calculation. "What's all that?" Isabelle swallowed hard, her throat raw. "We need to talk inside." Marlene hesitated. Just for a breath. Then she stepped aside, ushering Isabelle into the living room, where the same floral couch sat the same faded afghan draped across its back. It was so heartbreakingly unchanged that Isabelle nearly crumpled right there, her knees threatening to give. "Is everything okay?" Marlene asked too brightly. Her hands smoothed down the front of her blouse, fussing with invisible wrinkles. "You look pale, darling. Sit down, I'll put on some tea." "No." Isabelle's voice came out sharper than she intended. She tightened her grip on the folder until her knuckles ached. "This won't take long." Marlene hovered by the armchair, her eyebrows pulling together. "Izzy, you're scaring me." Isabelle drew in a shuddering breath. Then she laid the folder on the coffee table and flipped it open. Photos spilled out, first Marlene on sunlit balconies, Marlene on foreign streets. Marlene with Alan's arm draped intimately around her shoulders. The final image was the cruelest, her mother's laughing face, over a candlelit dinner, her hand resting over Alan's, their fingers intertwined. Marlene's color drained so fast it was like watching a storm cloud pass over her features. What is this?" Isabelle couldn't stop. The words poured out, jagged and breathless. Bank transfers, flight itineraries, credit card statements from the trust account Dad left for us, me, Thomas, Emma. Money you were supposed to use for our futures, our college tuition, our security. Instead, you spent it on trips, on him. Her fingers stabbed the photo of Alan. "Dad's best friend. How could you, Mom? How could you do this to us?" Marlene's mouth opened and closed her eyes, darting across the damning evidence like a trapped animal. "Where did you get all this? Did you hire someone to spy on me?" Her voice pitched up, brittle with disbelief. Isabelle flinched, her chest twisting painfully. "Yes, I had to. Because you were never going to tell us the truth on your own." For a moment, Marlene just stood there, breathing heavily. Then something hard flashed across her face, a stony defiance Isabelle recognized from every childhood argument where Marlene decided her authority could not be questioned. "This is family business!" Marlene snapped, snatching up one of the papers with shaking fingers. "You have no idea the sacrifices I've made. How dare you pry into things you can't possibly understand? That money, it's always been family money. I was your father's wife. I had to make decisions for all of us." Isabelle recoiled as if slapped. "Decisions? You mean lying to your kids for 15 years? Letting us think we were one missed paycheck from losing the house while you were eating escargot in Paris with Alan?" "Watch your tone," Marlene hissed. Her chest heaved, eyes glassy but sharp. "I did what I had to do to hold this family together, to keep us from falling apart completely after your father died." By screwing his best friend, the words ripped out of Isabelle raw and vicious. She didn't even realize she was crying until her vision swam. "By stealing our futures, Thomas had to drop out of college. Emma has been rationing her asthma meds because she feels guilty asking me for help. All while you were booking 5-star hotels." "That is enough!" Marlene's voice cracked across the room like a whip. Her hands trembled, nails digging into her palms. "I am your mother. You don't talk to me like that." Isabelle let out a hollow laugh, a jagged sound that felt like it scraped her throat bloody. "You're my mother. Then where were you when I was working 3 jobs to keep my studio? Where were you when Thomas was sleeping in his truck because he couldn't afford an apartment? Where were you when Emma had her last asthma attack and thought she might die alone in her dorm room because she was too scared to call an ambulance?" Marlene's shoulders slumped, but her mouth twisted into something cruel. "You think this has been easy for me? You children don't understand pressure. I did everything I could to keep up appearances so we wouldn't be pitied by this town. I made sure you all still had some dignity left." Dignity. Isabelle's tears streamed unchecked now. "We were ashamed to even have friends over because we thought we were broke, because we thought we'd be judged for having nothing. Meanwhile, you were living your second life with Alan on our inheritance." Marlene's breath came ragged, her face blotchy with rising hysteria. "Condamn Dieu trame sao," she spit out suddenly in harsh, trembling Vietnamese, falling back into the language she only used when furious or terrified. "Do la tien gia din, me coquien." Isabelle staggered back as if physically shoved. Her mother's fury scorched her more painful than any slap. For a heartbeat, she saw the small woman who used to wrap Isabelle in quilts on stormy nights, whispering stories of how strong girls survived wolves. But that image crumbled under the weight of this stranger snarling at her, now defending betrayal with a righteousness that made Isabelle's skin crawl. She pressed a hand to her mouth, a sob breaking free. I can't look at you right now." Then she turned and fled. The old front door slammed against the wall behind her with a reverberation that felt like it might split her in two. "Isabelle, Isabelle," Marlene's voice cracked in the hallway, half command, half plea. But Isabelle didn't stop. She hurtled down the steps, nearly twisting her ankle, fumbling with her keys, until she threw herself into the car and locked the doors with trembling hands. Inside the car, her breath came in sharp, painful sobs. Through the windshield, she could see her mother standing on the porch, one hand clutching the doorframe as if she needed its support to keep from crumpling. Their eyes met just for a second, and then Isabelle threw the car into gear and tore away, leaving behind the only home she'd ever known. Because right now, it didn't feel like home at all. It felt like a mausoleum filled with ghosts of promises that had never been real. Isabelle drove through the slick Portland streets that night with her hands clamped so tightly on the steering wheel, her knuckles glowed bone white under the dash lights. The windshield wipers scraped rhythmically, flinging sheets of drizzle aside, but nothing could clear the storm that churned in her chest. Her mother's voice still rang in her ears, furious, desperate, sharp enough to carve new wounds. "Do la tien jiadin me coquien." She kept replaying every moment of their confrontation like a cruel highlight reel, the way Marlene's face had twisted from fear to scorn, how easily she'd deflected guilt into indignation. Isabelle had walked into that house hoping for confession, some tiny spark of remorse, and instead found a mother willing to burn every bridge if it meant protecting her twisted narrative of sacrifice. She pressed harder on the gas. Her studio was only 15 minutes away. She needed the cold sanctuary of it, the smell of turpentine and old wood floors canvases that didn't lie. Maybe she could pull out her knives and slash her way into new lines on the canvas, purge the poison rising in her throat. Anything to stop feeling like she might unravel right there behind the wheel. Her phone buzzed in the passenger seat. Thomas, then Emma. Voicemails stacking up. Isabelle couldn't bear to hear either of them right now. The betrayal was still too raw, too singular. Her mother's betrayal, yes, but also her own. For being the oldest, for not questioning sooner, for letting Marlene's illusions govern all their lives. A pair of headlights flared in her rearview mirror startlingly close. Isabelle blinked, trying to clear the smear of tears that kept distorting the road. The truck behind her didn't slow. Instead, it edged up even tighter, bright halogen beams flooding her little hatchback, forcing her to squint. She flicked her turn signal, intending to pull over and let the asshole pass. But the moment she began to ease right, the truck swung wide too, almost deliberately matching her move, then drifting closer until its hulking side loomed against her driver's side mirror. Panic spiked through her veins. Isabelle straightened the wheel sharply, heart-hammering. The truck didn't back off. Instead, it edged nearer, crowding her into the shoulder-massive tires, spitting water onto her windshield. Her wipers stuttered under the assault. Oh God, she breathed, voice cracking. She tapped her brakes, hoping the driver would surge ahead. Instead, the truck braked too, pacing her with chilling precision. The road curved ahead, narrow, guardrail glistening wet. Beyond it, only darkness and the faint suggestion of a ravine. Her pulse skyrocketed. Isabelle's hands were slick with sweat, slipping slightly as she tightened her grip. The truck jolted sideways, just a hair, but enough to bump her mirror, sending a sharp crack through the cabin. Isabelle screamed instinctively, jerking the wheel right. Her tires skidded on slick asphalt, fishtailing. She slammed her foot on the brake. The world spun sideways. Headlights, trees, the metal guardrail blurring past. Then a brutal jolt as her car slammed to a stop against the curb front bumper, crumpling with a sick metallic pop. Her airbag didn't deploy, thank God, but her entire body snapped forward painfully against the seatbelt. Her lungs seized. For a moment, all she could hear was her own ragged, wet breathing. Through the fog of adrenaline, she realized the truck had pulled up beside her. It idled there, hulking and patient. Her hands fumbled for her phone, but before she could even bring it to life, the passenger side window of the truck rolled down. Alan. His face was illuminated in harsh gold from his overhead cab light, older than she remembered, lines grooved deeper by sun and self-satisfaction. But his eyes were hard, flat, as cold as the rain. He leaned slightly out the window, casual, like they were just two neighbors chatting across a picket fence. Isabelle, he drawled, voice smooth and contemptuous. That was sloppy driving. You should be more careful on these wet roads. She could barely force words past the thickness in her throat. Why are you even… Alan sighed almost theatrically, as if this were all some tedious inconvenience. Listen carefully. I don't particularly care how righteous you feel right now. You want to hate your mother, fine. Air your dirty laundry at Christmas dinner for all I care. But you start dragging this through, courts start turning over rocks with lawyers and journalists, then you're going to force my hand. A strangled, bitter laugh clawed its way out of her. Force your hand? What are you talking about, Alan? You nearly ran me off the road. His expression didn't even flicker. Prove it. Who's going to believe some frantic artist with an axe to grind over me? I've known your family since before you were born. Hell, half this town thinks of me as your second uncle. Isabelle's stomach lurched. Her skin crawled under the weight of that oily familiarity. He leaned a little further, raindrops sparkling in the strands of his thinning hair. Don't dig deeper, Isabelle. If you keep chasing this publicly, it won't be your reputation that gets shredded. It'll be your mother's. You think she's fragile now? Wait until you see her hauled off in cuffs, or your sweet little sister dragged into depositions. You want Emma to testify about funds she never touched, about her mother siphoning her future away, because that's where this goes. Her hands balled into fists on the steering wheel nails, biting deep into her palms. She did that to herself, not me. I didn't choose any of this. Sure you did. Alan's smile was cold, mirthless. You chose to hire someone. You chose to start this mess, but you still have a choice now. Walk away. Let it die. The money's gone either way. You can't get blood from a stone. Leave it be and we all keep our dignity. And your mother stays out of prison. Her breath came in harsh, uneven shudders. Outside, the rain had slowed to a mournful drizzle, fat drops plinking off Alan's side mirror. In that moment, the world felt impossibly small. Just her in her dented hatchback. Alan perched like some vulture in his monstrous truck, the threat of complete ruin hanging over them both. Alan's eyes narrowed slightly, voice dropping to something almost intimate. Be smart, Isabelle. You're a bright girl. Always were. Don't make this uglier than it needs to be. Then he rolled up his window without waiting for a reply. The truck idled for another heartbeat, long enough to cement the threat before rumbling off into the night taillights, disappearing around the bend. Isabelle sat there for several minutes after gasping for breath like a swimmer who'd nearly drowned. Her entire body shook violently, adrenaline still surging. When she finally managed to peel her fingers from the steering wheel, they left behind crescent moons of blood where her nails had pierced the skin. She pressed her forehead to the wheel, eyes squeezed shut, whispering into the damp hush of her shattered car. "I won't stop, I don't care what it costs." Because standing down wasn't courage, it was complicity. And after everything her mother had stolen, after the smirk on Alan's face, she would burn her world to the ground before letting them walk away clean. That night, Isabelle barely made it back to her small apartment above the flower shop on Alberta Street. She stumbled inside, still tasting fear, metallic and sharp on her tongue. Her hands shook so badly she dropped her keys twice before they finally clattered onto the countertop. Then she pressed her back against the door, as if expecting Alan to burst through it, demanding obedience with that same venomous smile. She stood there for what might have been an hour. The city's neon glow bled in through the blinds, tracing eerie lines across the floorboards. Outside, a siren wailed distant and detached, as though Portland itself was indifferent to the quiet ruin inside her chest. At some point, she must have drifted to the couch. Curled in on herself under the old blue afghan her grandmother had crocheted, Isabelle shivered despite the mild spring night. Her body refused rest. Every time her eyes slipped closed, they snapped open again, wide and wild, searching for headlights through the window. When sleep finally took her, it did so brutally, dragging her under in a chokehold of restless dreams. She stood on the porch of her childhood home. It was evening, the sky streaked with the bruised colors of an Oregon sunset. Her father was there, leaning against the railing exactly the way he used to, with one hand braced on the worn wood, the other absently smoothing the collar of his plaid shirt. But his eyes were wrong. Instead of twinkling with warm humor or gentle pride, they were hollow twin wells of sorrow that seemed to look straight through her. "Daddy," she whispered, but her voice made no sound. Behind him, the front door swung open. Marlene stepped out, radiant in a dress Isabelle didn't recognize, emerald silk that shimmered with each tiny shift of her hips. Her laughter rang out bright and musical as Alan emerged beside her, his hand settling familiarly on the small of Marlene's back. Isabelle wanted to scream, to rush forward to drag her mother away from this obscene tableau, to demand her father see what was happening. But her feet were rooted to the porch like they'd grown there. Her father turned his head just slightly toward her, and for the briefest moment, Isabelle thought he might speak. Instead, he just smiled, a tired, broken thing, and then slowly faded like smoke caught by the wind. Marlene and Alan remained, their forms growing sharper, their laughter louder. It filled the entire twilight sky until Isabelle clapped her hands over her ears. But even then it crawled inside, echoing in her skull, rattling loose every fragile thing still holding her together. She jerked awake on the couch with a strangled gasp, heart pounding so hard it hurt. The sun was already bleeding through the blinds, thin, pale fingers reaching across the floor. Isabelle pressed a hand to her chest and felt the sweat cooling there, sticky and clammy. For a few fragile minutes, she almost let the fear win. Her mind spun frantic circles around Alan's oily threats, Emma dragged through depositions, Thomas forced to testify, Marlene handcuffed on the courthouse steps. That part of her that still remembered lullabies and bedtime stories ached to protect what was left of their family name, even if it meant swallowing every bitter truth. But then her father's eyes from the dream flashed through her again, hollow, disappointed, lost. The trust he'd tried so desperately to build for them wasn't just money. It was his last act of love, his final safeguard for the children he wouldn't live to see grown. And Marlene had squandered it. Alan had profited from it. They'd laughed together in Paris while Thomas skipped meals to pay car insurance. They danced in Buenos Aires while Emma rationed inhalers. Isabelle wiped her face roughly. She wasn't going to be the reason they all got away with it, even if it terrified her, even if Alan's truck lurked around every corner of her mind now. She pulled her phone off the coffee table and found Jack Holland's contact. Her thumb hovered for only a heartbeat before she pressed the call button. He answered on the second ring, sounding faintly surprised. "Isabelle. You all right? You don't usually call this early." "No." Her voice cracked and she cleared her throat. "No, I'm not all right. Alan cornered me last night, ran me off the road." There was a beat of stunned silence. Then Jack's voice sharpened into a kind of quiet fury that made Isabelle grateful he was on her side. "Jesus Christ, are you hurt?" "No, just shaken. My car's a mess." "He threatened me. Told me to drop this or he'd make sure my mother goes to prison. Said Emma would be forced to testify. That it would all come out ugly." Jack exhaled slowly, as if trying to keep his own rage in check. "That's witness intimidation, pure and simple. I know a couple guys at the DA's office who'd be real interested in hearing about it, but that's your call, Isabelle. What do you want to do?" She closed her eyes. Her father's hollow stare returned again, accompanied by the echo of Alan's smug voice. A fresh swell of nausea rolled through her, but underneath it was something steadier, something hard. "I want more," she said finally. Her fingers tightened around the phone until it hurt. "I want every transaction. I want proof of every wire transfer Alan ever got from my mother's accounts. I want to know how much he's sitting on, how many other properties he might have, and I want it soon before he starts covering tracks." Jack let out a low whistle. "All right, Isabelle. That's a hell of a move, but it's the right one if you're serious. I'll put more boots on the ground. Rerun asset checks, dig for any holding company's hidden investments. We'll find it." "Thank you," she whispered, because if she tried for anything stronger, her voice would shatter. I need to finish this, Jack, even if it means losing her forever." "Listen to me," Jack said, his gruff tone unusually gentle. "Whatever we turn up, that's on them, not you. You're not destroying your family by shining a light on this. They did that the minute they decided their pleasure was worth more than your futures. Remember that." Isabelle nodded, though he couldn't see. Her free hand curled into a fist on her thigh. "Call me the moment you get anything." "Count on it," Jack promised. When she hung up, the apartment felt different. Not lighter, if anything, the air seemed heavier, dense with the weight of what she'd just set in motion. But it was a chosen weight, a burden she was willing to carry, so Thomas and Emma never again lay awake, wondering why their childhoods had felt like tightropes strung over an abyss. Isabelle rose, legs still unsteady. In the corner, her latest painting waited on its easel, half-finished, a swirl of bruised purples and restless reds. She crossed to it, lifted her palette knife, and began working again. Each sharp stroke sliced through more than just pigment. It carved away the last of her fear, leaving behind something raw and unstoppable. No matter what Alan threatened, no matter how Marlene wept or raged or tried to justify her sins, Isabelle would see this through, even if it meant standing alone in the wreckage of everything she'd once called family. Isabelle sat across from a new conference table, this one in a downtown high-rise with gleaming windows that overlooked Portland's rainy sprawl like some indifferent god. The building felt sterile, all polished steel and hushed tones, a far cry from her studio's cluttered chaos. But right now, she needed sterile. She needed focused, hard edges. The lawyer she'd hired, Melissa Grant, was young, but carried herself with a precise, almost surgical calm that gave Isabelle hope. Melissa wore sleek black suits, spoke in clipped, methodical sentences, and seemed to devour paperwork like it was air. "All right," Melissa said, flipping through the expanding folder of financial records that Jack's team had unearthed. "This is more than enough to file a civil suit for breach of fiduciary duty and conversion. Because your mother was the trustee of the fund, she had a legal obligation to use it solely for the benefit of you and your siblings. Instead, well, these statements are damning." Isabelle swallowed, hard fingers worrying the hem of her sleeve. "And Alan. Based on the wire transfers, he's looking at civil conspiracy to defraud. Possibly more if we can tie him to knowingly encouraging your mother's misuse of the trust. Given the personal spending and shared accounts, he's neck deep. Once we subpoena his financials, it could get very interesting." "Will my mother go to jail?" Melissa's eyes softened for the briefest second. "It's possible, though criminal charges would be up to the DA. What we're doing now is filing to claw back as much of the misappropriated funds as we can, to reclaim assets, freeze accounts, and ensure what remains is divided among the rightful beneficiaries, meaning you, Thomas, and Emma." Isabelle's breath shook out of her. I never thought I'd be here, preparing to drag my own mother into court." Melissa closed the file, her expression firm but not unkind. "You didn't put her here, Isabelle. Her choices did. Your father left that trust to protect his children's futures. This is you honoring that. And frankly, it's long overdue." But even as Isabelle steeled herself, Alan was working his own campaign. It started subtly. Emma called her 2 nights later, voice tight with worry. "Izzy Allen showed up at my place today. Just out of nowhere. Said he was in the neighborhood, thought he'd take me for coffee. It was so weird, I haven't seen him in years." Isabelle's stomach turned to ice. "What did he want?" I don't know. He kept asking how you were doing. Said he was worried about you. That you've been under a lot of strain lately. His words, not mine. And then he said something about how you might be, not seeing things clearly, that you could be having a kind of paranoid episode." The phone shook in Isabelle's grip. "God, he's trying to isolate me. He knows if he can make you two doubt me." "Isabelle, stop. I didn't say I believed him." Emma's voice was gentle, but underneath it was a current of something stronger. I wanted to call you right away to hear your side, because honestly, the whole thing set off alarms in my head. Alan was too slick. It felt rehearsed. Relief pricked Isabelle's eyes. Thank you for telling me. Please just be careful, Em. Don't go anywhere alone with him. And if he tries again, call me, or the police. I will, I promise. But it wasn't just Emma. A day later, Thomas showed up outside Isabelle's studio unannounced, looking rough around the edges. His beard was scruffier than usual, circles under his eyes, dark and heavy. He shuffled inside, hands stuffed in his jacket pockets. Alan caught me outside the shop yesterday, he said without preamble. Same shit, asking if you'd been acting strange. If maybe all this was stress hallucinations. If I remembered how sensitive you were as a kid. Isabelle pressed a hand to her mouth. Jesus. Thomas let out a short, bitter laugh. I told him to go to hell, but then all night I kept running circles in my head because it's Mom, you know, part of me wants to believe she couldn't do all that, that there's some explanation. Wordlessly, Isabelle walked to her cluttered workbench. She pulled out the folder Melissa had prepared, a neat binder with tabbed sections, color-coded charts showing cash outflows, highlighted travel logs. She pressed it into Thomas's hands. Read it, all of it, then tell me I'm paranoid. Thomas stood there unmoving. His jaw worked. Then, with a resigned exhale, he pulled up a stool and began flipping through the binder. The studio fell silent except for the whisper of pages, the occasional soft huff as he shook his head. 20 minutes passed before he finally slammed the cover closed. That's it then. His voice was rough. It's not a question anymore. It's fact. She robbed us. Isabelle sank into the opposite chair, tears threatening again. But Thomas reached across the table, laid his rough mechanic's hand over hers, and squeezed. I don't know how we're going to come out of this as a family. Maybe we don't. But you were right to start this, Izzy. I'm with you. Relief poured through her so intensely it made her dizzy. Thank you. I was so afraid he'd poison you two against me. He gave a humorless half-smile. Alan's always been a charmer, but even he can't rewrite this much evidence. The next morning, Isabelle, Thomas, and Emma sat together at the little bistro near her studio, an awkward triangle of coffee cups and shared trauma. Emma kept dabbing at her eyes with a napkin, her other hand clamped around Thomas's arm like an anchor. I keep remembering when Mom used to send us to the corner store with coupons for generic cereal, Emma whispered, and then she'd come home with new shoes or a bottle of perfume. I thought it was normal, or that maybe she was just treating herself a little because she was sad. Now I see it was all with money meant for us. Thomas let out a strangled noise. It's like we've been living in her cover story our whole damn lives. Isabelle reached for both of them. Listen to me. Whatever happens in court, whatever Mom tries to say, don't doubt yourselves. We have the truth, and we have each other. That's more than they've got. They sat there for a long while, leaning into each other, three broken pieces, trying to forge something new out of the wreckage. That afternoon, Isabelle walked back into Melissa's office with renewed fire. Together, they compiled affidavits from Thomas and Emma combined with the investigator's findings. Melissa laid it all out with clinical precision. This is the skeleton of our suit. We'll move to freeze any accounts tied to Marlene and Alan. File for an immediate injunction on property sales so they can't liquidate assets to hide them. If Alan's name is anywhere on Mom's accounts, we drag him straight into this too. Isabelle stared down at the paperwork, her father's ghost hovering at the edges of her thoughts. His trust hadn't protected them like he'd hoped, but she could. She would. File it, she said finally, her voice clear, almost shockingly steady. No more waiting, they've stolen enough of our lives already. And for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something close to strong again. Because now it wasn't just pain driving her, it was the certainty that she was fighting for more than restitution. She was fighting for the truth her father would have wanted, and that made her unstoppable. They met in the same living room where Isabelle had once played with blocks at her father's feet, where Thomas had taken prom pictures awkwardly holding his corsage, where Emma had tearfully practiced her valedictorian speech. Now the floral couch seemed a mockery of every warm memory, the faded afghan on its back like a shroud. Marlene sat in the corner chair, hands knotted tightly in her lap. She looked older than Isabelle remembered, more so than even a few weeks ago. Lines carved deep around her mouth, dark smudges hollowing her eyes. Alan stood by the fireplace, arms crossed, his jaw flexing with thinly veiled contempt. The air itself felt brittle, like a single wrong word might shatter it. Isabelle spread the folders across the coffee table one by one. Financial statements, notarized affidavits, travel logs. Then the photos, Marlene in Santorini with her dress whipping around her knees, Alan's hand on the small of her back, Marlene on the Amalfi Coast tipping her head to accept a kiss from Alan. statements showing trust fund withdrawals precisely matching flights to Tokyo to Buenos Aires. Emma sat beside Isabelle, shoulders trembling. Thomas hovered behind them, broad arms, folded eyes hard. Isabelle took a breath so deep it hurt. We're here because we deserve answers. Not spin, not excuses. The truth. Marlene's lips parted, but no sound emerged. Her chest rose and fell rapidly. Alan let out a disgusted huff. This is a waste of time. You've made your little point with your amateur investigation. Congratulations. Now tear those up before you ruin what's left of your families. Of our families what? Thomas cut in sharply, voice low dangerous. Reputation. You think there's anything left of that after this? Alan's nostrils flared. He looked like he might lunge across the table, but Isabelle ignored him, keeping her gaze locked on Marlene. Mom, please, I want to hear it from you, all of it. For a heartbeat longer, Marlene clung to silence. Then the dam broke. A shudder tore through her frame. Her hands flew to her face and she began to sob deep, wrenching sounds that made Emma flinch. When she finally looked up, her eyes were rimmed red mascara streaked to her jawline. You don't understand what it was like, she choked out. Losing your father, it didn't just kill him, it killed me too. I was a widow at 42 with 3 kids, no clue how to fill that hole in my chest. That hole was supposed to be filled by us, Isabelle whispered. Your family. Not her voice broke. Not Paris hotel rooms with Dad's best friend. Marlene rocked forward, pressing a trembling hand to her sternum. I know, but Alan, he made me feel wanted again. I spent years buried under grief, under bills, under the pitying looks from everyone in town. Then Alan started calling. He'd come by to check on us, to fix little things around the house. And one night, it just happened. Suddenly, I wasn't the sad woman people crossed the street to avoid. I was someone worth loving. Thomas's mouth twisted into a sneer. At the cost of your kids' futures. Marlene's voice grew frantic, words tumbling over each other. I thought there was enough money. At first it was little things, weekends away, nice dinners. Alan said it was all just borrowed against happier days we deserved. I believed him. By the time I realized the trust was nearly drained, I was in too deep. And Alan promised me it would all work out. That he'd take care of us. He didn't take care of anyone but himself, Isabelle snapped, her hands curled into claws over the edge of the coffee table. You watched Thomas drop out of college. You let Emma ration her asthma inhalers. You watched me live on cup noodles in a freezing loft because I thought there was nothing left. You let us all believe we were poor. Marlene doubled over, sobs tearing out of her. I'm so sorry. I swear I didn't mean. Alan snorted. Oh, come off it, Marlene. Don't grovel. They'll get over it. Money's money. Thomas's head jerked toward him, eyes blazing. You think this is about money? You wrecked our family. You poisoned everything good we ever had. Alan sneered, his voice turning oily. You kids are spoiled. You grew up with more than most. He lunged suddenly across the table, snatching at the folder nearest Isabelle. Papers scattered in a flutter of damning confetti. Alan's hand closed over another folder, ripping it free, shoving Isabelle back against the couch. Give it here, Alan barked. This crap dies tonight. Before Isabelle could react, Thomas was there. He grabbed Alan's shoulder and yanked him backward with all the force of a man who spent his days hauling compressors and steel beams. Alan's eyes went wide as his feet tangled. He crashed into the corner curio cabinet glass, exploding around him in a cascade of tiny diamonds. Emma screamed. Isabelle's heart stuttered painfully. Alan slumped to the floor, shards skittering under him, blood blooming bright on his forearm from a long, ugly gash. Thomas loomed over him, chest heaving. Touch her again, touch any of us, and I swear to God you won't get back up next time. Alan groaned, clutching his bleeding arm, his breath coming in panicked little huffs. Marlene was on her feet now, too, hands fluttering uselessly toward Alan, toward Thomas, toward the shattered mess of her living room. Her mouth opened and closed around half-formed pleas. Isabelle stared at the blood, at Alan's twisted grimace, at her mother crumpled and sobbing into trembling hands. The family portrait above the couch tilted drunkenly on its nail, a photo from 15 years ago. Her father's smiling face seemed to watch the carnage below, eyes bright, with a warmth that felt like an accusation. Thomas stepped back, finally, shoulders sagging as adrenaline drained away. Emma collapsed against Isabelle, clutching her arm so tightly it hurt. Alan struggled to stand, slipping a little in the crimson smear before finding his footing. His eyes darted around the room, calculating cold, then landed on Marlene. He let out a breath that might have been contempt or resignation. This was never going to last anyway, he muttered. Then he pushed past them all, stumbling through the front door without another word, leaving bloody fingerprints on the frame. The room went still. The only sound was Marlene's soft, shattered weeping. Isabelle sank down onto the couch, her body trembling in deep, painful waves. Emma tucked in close, tears silent on her cheeks. Thomas stood by the door, still panting, his hands flexing and unflexing as if trying to shake off the last violent echo of what he'd done. For a long moment, none of them moved. The broken glass glinted on the carpet like cruel little stars. Outside, the world continued obliviously, birds, trilling cars hissing by on wet streets, utterly indifferent to the wreckage inside these four walls. Finally, Marlene lifted her head. Her face was blotchy and streaked with tears, her voice little more than a husk. "I never wanted to hurt you, any of you. I wanted to feel alive again. Wanted to believe someone could still want me." Isabelle met her gaze across the chaos of splintered wood and blood-stained shards. Her heart twisted painfully, full of old tenderness that felt foreign now, like trying to remember the taste of something sweet after years of salt. But it didn't change the truth. "You destroyed us to feel loved," Isabelle whispered, "and that's something none of us will ever forget." Marlene's shoulders crumpled again. She folded in on herself, sobs echoing off the cracked glass and faded floral wallpaper. Thomas turned away. Emma buried her face in Isabelle's shoulder. And for the first time in her life, Isabelle felt truly motherless, untethered from every comforting lie that had ever soothed her to sleep. But beneath that yawning ache was something else: resolve. Because this story wasn't over, and she wouldn't let it end with Alan's smug departure or her mother's ruinous grief. There was still justice to be had, still truth to carve out of the wreckage. And Isabelle Torres intended to see it through, no matter how many scars it left behind. The wail of sirens fractured the fragile silence that had settled over the Torres house, splintering it into jagged, shivering pieces. Red and blue lights slashed through the front windows, crawling across the faded walls and floral couch like restless ghosts. Isabelle stood by the living room archway, hands knotted in front of her, breath coming in short, uneven pulls. Emma clung to her side, her face blotched with tears, while Thomas paced back and forth in the foyer, muscles taut as cables. It all felt grotesquely surreal, a kind of nightmare logic where her family home scene of every birthday, every Thanksgiving dinner, every sleepy Sunday morning now stood transformed into a crime scene humming with radios and low murmurs of uniformed officers. Through the front door came two paramedics with a stretcher flanked by a pair of officers. Alan sat slumped on a dining chair, his shirt sleeves soaked dark with blood from the deep cut Thomas had unwittingly given him. One of the paramedics carefully peeled back the fabric, examining the wound, while another pulled gauze and antiseptic from her bag. Alan didn't look at Isabelle, didn't look at anyone, really. His eyes were distant, glassy, as though staring straight through the busy living room to some far-off place only he could see. When the officers finally approached, one reading from a small notepad, Alan's jaw tightened imperceptibly. Isabelle caught the faintest glimmer of calculation there, his mind already working the angles, looking for an exit, a pivot, a story that would spin him out of this mess with the least possible damage. But then the other officer stepped closer. "Mr. Langford, you're under arrest for reckless endangerment and aggravated vehicular assault," he recited crisply. "The city traffic grid has footage from last night's near collision with Ms. Torres's vehicle. You nearly forced her off the road, sir. That's felony reckless. You'll need to come with us." For a heartbeat, Alan's composure cracked. His eyes darted wildly, sweat beading on his upper lip. Then it was gone, replaced by a snide half-smile as he lifted his uninjured hand. "Do what you need to do, officers. I'll have this cleared up by noon tomorrow." They cuffed him anyway. He winced when they tightened around his injured wrist. Isabelle stood very still as they led him through the front door, her pulse a slow, heavy drumbeat. Watching him cross the threshold felt like watching a ghost evaporate some malignant presence finally exorcised from the only home she'd ever known. But that was only half the reckoning. Outside, two more patrol cars idled at the curb. Neighbors had started to gather, drawn by the lights, by the dull drama of it all. Isabelle saw Mrs. Sanderson from across the street, clutching her housecoat closed at her throat, eyes wide behind thick glasses. Next to her, the Ramirez boys gawked unabashedly, whispering to each other as the police guided Alan, now scowling and handcuffed, down the walk to a waiting cruiser. Then another pair of officers approached the porch, this time flanking Marlene. Her mother's face was blotchy, her hair disheveled from where she'd pulled at it with shaking hands. Tear tracks cut shiny paths through her makeup. She looked more frightened than Isabelle had ever seen her, smaller, somehow almost crumpled under an invisible weight. "Mrs. Torres," one of the officers said gently but firmly, "you're under arrest on charges of trust mismanagement, embezzlement, and fraud. We'll have to process you downtown. You have the right to remain silent." The rest blurred. Isabelle's breath caught painfully. It wasn't that she hadn't expected this. Melissa had warned them the moment they filed suit that criminal referrals might be inevitable. The evidence was overwhelming. The state took very dim views on trustees siphoning funds meant for minors, especially when it spanned over a decade and nearly $500,000. But expectation was different from reality. Watching the officers take her mother's hands and guide them behind her back, watching the gleam of steel slip over delicate wrists Isabelle had once clung to. Crossing busy streets felt like something inside her chest cracking open. Marlene didn't struggle, didn't curse or plead. She just stood there, eyes blown wide, breath shallow, letting them cuff her as if in a trance. Then her gaze lifted and found Isabelle's. For a single electric moment, the years rolled backward to scraped knees and warm baths, to lullabies whispered over tangled hair, to promises that nothing bad could ever touch them as long as they were together. Then the moment passed. Marlene's face crumpled, fresh tears spilling. Her lips moved, though no sound came at first. When it did, it was a whisper that seemed to claw straight out of her lungs. "Isabelle, I'm so sorry." Isabelle pressed a hand over her mouth. Her own tears came hot and relentless. She didn't know what she felt: rage, grief, a savage, desperate wish that any of this could be undone, that she could close her eyes, reopen them, and find her mother again in the kitchen making cinnamon toast. Alan, just her father's goofy friend, telling dumb jokes, the trust still untouched, her father's dreams for them all intact. But there was no undoing it, only consequences, only this. Emma sobbed outright beside her, turning her face into Isabelle's shoulder. Thomas stood behind them, breathing heavily, eyes rimmed red but resolute. Isabelle felt all of it press into her from both sides. Emma's fragile tremors, Thomas's looming, protective silence. It was all that held her upright. Marlene's gaze lingered on them, drinking them in as though trying to etch this final image of her children into memory. Then the officers guided her gently down the porch steps. The neighbors parted in stunned silence. The cruiser door opened and closed, and just like that, their mother was gone. It felt like hours later, after statements were given, after Emma was led inside by Thomas to lie down after the last patrol car finally pulled away, that Isabelle found herself sitting alone on the front steps. The air was cool damp from lingering drizzle. It smelled of wet grass and ozone, a scent that normally would have calmed her. Tonight, it just scraped raw across her nerves. Her phone buzzed in her lap. A message from Melissa: charges formally filed. They'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. I'll meet you all at the courthouse. Hang in there, Isabelle. She stared at the screen until the letters blurred. Then she set it aside and buried her face in her hands. Part of her had thought this moment would bring relief, justice, closure, something that felt like triumph. But instead, there was only a hollow, echoing ache. Like all the love she'd ever stored up for her mother had been scooped out, leaving nothing but air and regret. Eventually, Thomas came out and lowered himself beside her on the steps. Neither spoke. They didn't have to. His hand found hers rough and solid, and she clung to it like a lifeline. Inside, she could hear Emma crying softly, a sound that might break her heart all over again if there was anything left to break. Isabelle closed her eyes and let her tears fall. For her mother, for her father's broken legacy, for the siblings she'd dragged into this war because she couldn't stand another lie. And strangely for herself, who once believed that love alone was enough to keep a family whole. It wasn't victory, it wasn't peace, but it was the truth, and that had to count for something. The courtroom was a cold, echoing cavern that seemed to drain the color out of everything inside it. Pale oak benches, bleak gray carpeting, walls so stark they might as well have been stripped of sympathy. Isabelle sat stiff-backed between Thomas and Emma, her hands folded so tightly in her lap they felt numb skin stretched over tense bones. All around them, people murmured in low, respectful tones, clerks shuffling papers, a bailiff adjusting his belt, the faint rustle of suits and polished shoes moving across the floor. It was a solemn theater of order that felt almost obscene given how chaotic Isabelle's heart was beating. At the front, Marlene stood between her defense counsel and Alan, who looked sullen and bored, his chin tipped up in quiet disdain. Marlene's wrists were free today, no cuffs in view, but the illusion of dignity was paper-thin. Her shoulders curled inward, her eyes red-rimmed. Every time she shifted the tiny jewelry, she still wore thin gold hoops. Her wedding ring, she inexplicably hadn't removed, seemed to mock her with faint glints of light. The prosecutor, a steely woman named Victoria Pellman, stepped up to the lectern. Her voice was precise, cold, without being theatrical. Each syllable landed like a stone dropped in still water. Your Honor, the state will show that over a period exceeding 15 years, the defendant Marlene Torres knowingly and repeatedly breached her fiduciary duty as the sole trustee of the Charles Torres Family Trust. This trust was established for the exclusive benefit of the decedent's 3 children, Isabelle Torres, Thomas Torres, and Emma Torres, following his untimely passing. Isabelle's throat constricted. She couldn't help but look over at Emma, who was blinking furiously as if trying to keep tears from spilling. Thomas kept one hand on Emma's knee, anchoring her with that steady protective weight. Pellman continued, her crisp voice cutting through the courtroom's hush. The defendant systematically diverted assets, both liquid funds and investment earnings, totaling approximately $412,000 for personal use. These misappropriated funds were employed to finance extensive international travel luxury accommodations, personal expenditures unrelated to the beneficiary's welfare, and to support her long-standing, intimate relationship with co-defendant Alan Langford. Alan's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. Alan just set his jaw tighter, refusing to glance Isabelle's way. If he felt any shame, he buried it well. The prosecutor flipped to the next page, reading in that same steady cadence. Meanwhile, the defendant's children endured significant financial hardships consistent with the misleading representations made by the trustee that the family's finances were strained, thereby causing all 3 beneficiaries to forego opportunities for education, stable housing, and medical care that the trust was specifically intended to support. Isabelle could feel her pulse roaring in her ears. Every carefully phrased line was a gut punch. She thought she'd prepared herself, had pored over documents, sat through hours of testimony with Melissa in cold conference rooms, but hearing it laid out in stark public record was another wound entirely. Emma made a faint sound, something between a sob and a gasp. Isabelle instinctively reached over and took her hand. Emma squeezed back so hard it hurt. On Emma's other side, Thomas stared dead ahead, his jaw-clenched eyes bright with something fierce and wet. A muscle ticked in his cheek. Pellman didn't soften. If anything, her voice grew sharper, propelled by the sheer audacity of what had been done. The evidence will include documented transfers from the trust's primary account into personal joint accounts held by the defendant and Mr. Langford. We will also submit a timeline of travel supported by passport stamps, airline booking records, and credit card expenditures demonstrating the misuse of these funds for repeated vacations abroad to destinations including France, Italy, Japan, Morocco, and Argentina, among others. Marlene flinched visibly at the mention of those places. Her hands fluttered up, then fell again, crumpling into fists at her sides. When Isabelle's eyes caught hers for just a second, Marlene's face contorted with something Isabelle couldn't parse. Shame, fear, maybe even a pleading hope for forgiveness. It nearly broke her. But then Isabelle's gaze slid to Alan, standing there like an arrogant effigy of betrayal, and any fragile pity drained away. The prosecutor's voice turned almost cutting in its final summary. The state will argue that these deliberate breaches of trust inflicted long-lasting financial and emotional harm on the intended beneficiaries, violating both statutory and moral obligations. We will seek restitution of remaining assets, punitive damages, and criminal penalties appropriate to the extent and duration of this fraud. When Pellman stepped back, the courtroom seemed to exhale collectively, a soft ripple of tension moving through the wooden pews. Isabelle hadn't even realized she was holding her breath. She drew in a shaky lungful of air, willing her racing heart to slow. Next, Marlene's attorney rose, a small, wiry man with glasses perched low on his nose. His voice was smoother, almost imploring. "Your Honor, my client fully acknowledges her lapse in judgment." Isabelle's stomach twisted violently. A lapse in judgment that felt like calling an earthquake a little tremor, a hurricane a drizzle. "But we intend to show that these actions were taken under significant emotional duress following the tragic death of her husband, Mr. Charles Torres. Furthermore, we will argue that while financial decisions may have been ill-considered, there was never malicious intent to permanently deprive the children of these funds." Beside her, Thomas let out a soft, incredulous scoff. Emma shivered all over, curling slightly toward Isabelle's shoulder. The lawyer droned on about grief, loneliness, stress, the same tired script Marlene had tried to use at home. Isabelle found herself gripping the bench so hard her fingers tingled, because the courtroom was the one place those rationalizations couldn't smother the truth. Here, numbers spoke louder than tears, and the hard weight of evidence crushed sentimentality into dust. At last, the opening statements ended. The judge, an older man with deep-set eyes and a weary demeanor, nodded somberly. He set the next hearing for testimony, cautioning both sides against trying the case in the press. Then he ordered a brief recess. As the bailiff called it out, the tension broke like glass. Chairs, scraped papers, shuffled, quiet murmurs began to swell. Marlene turned almost reflexively, searching for her children. Her gaze snagged on Isabelle, and for a moment she looked heartbreakingly like the mother Isabelle remembered, soft, vulnerable, almost childishly lost. Isabelle couldn't hold it. She dropped her eyes to the polished floor, blinking rapidly as tears gathered. Beside her, Emma pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. Thomas let out a low, ragged breath that might have been a curse or a prayer. They stood as one, stepping into the aisle. As they walked past the defense table, Isabelle's eyes lifted just briefly. Marlene reached out a tentative hand, fingers trembling. It hovered there between them, a mute plea. Isabelle didn't take it, couldn't. Instead, she kept moving, guiding Emma gently by the elbow, Thomas close behind. They left their mother standing there, hands suspended in empty air, face crumpling with the fresh realization of just how alone she was. Outside the courtroom doors, Emma collapsed into Thomas's arms, sobbing soundlessly. Isabelle leaned against the cool marble wall, letting her head fall back, staring up at the sterile fluorescent lights until her tears finally slipped free. This was only the beginning. The legal battle would drag on for months, maybe longer. More testimony, more forensic accountants, more of their private devastation aired out under harsh fluorescent cross-examination. But as painful as it was also necessary a final purging of every lie that had strangled their family for years. When Isabelle finally pushed off the wall, she slipped her arms around her sister and brother, pulling them close. Together they would walk back into the fray. Together they would finish what their mother and Alan had so carelessly begun. And maybe, just maybe, on the other side of all this ruin, there would be something worth rebuilding. The letter arrived folded neatly inside a plain cream envelope, the sort you might use for sending a birthday card or a note to an old friend. There was nothing remarkable about it. No official stamp from the county jail, just Marlene's shaky cursive spelling out Isabelle Torres across the front. But the moment Isabelle spotted it in her mailbox, her breath caught in her throat. Her heart performed a small, painful somersault. She carried it upstairs to her apartment like it was made of glass, set it on the little kitchen table where sun spilled in through the windows, stared at it for what felt like hours. She tried telling herself she didn't need to open it, that there was nothing inside that could change what had happened, nothing that could unwind the sharp, bloody history now woven through all of them. But eventually her hands betrayed her. They moved on their own, sliding under the flap, prying it open. The paper inside was line torn from a cheap notepad. It smelled faintly of bleach and institutional soap. Marlene's handwriting wavered, delicate loops gone erratic, letters slanting hard to the right, like they were desperate to run off the page. My dearest Isabelle, I know you probably don't want to hear from me. Maybe you've already decided to tear this up and throw it away. I wouldn't blame you. But I hope, perhaps selfishly, that you'll give me these few pages. It's the only way I can still speak to you. I've been trying to understand myself these past weeks, trying to pick through all the pieces of the woman I was before your father died, and the woman I let myself become after. I keep coming back to that night he left us, when he went to bed with a small headache and never woke up. Do you remember how small he looked in that hospital bed when they let us see him? As though all the color had been drained from him, as though the very shape of him had collapsed inward. That was the moment the world cracked for me. I stood there holding your hand, your tiny trusting hand, and I thought, how am I supposed to do this alone? Isabelle's eyes blurred. She pressed her palm to her cheek, felt the tears slip warm and traitorous beneath it. She wanted to be angry still, wanted to hold on to that bright, clarifying rage that had gotten her through court hearings and depositions and endless meetings with Melissa. But her mother's words were like tiny barbed hooks catching at places in Isabelle that still remembered lullabies and warm cinnamon toast. Alan started coming by only a month later, bringing flowers, fixing the leaky faucet. It felt so good to be needed again, to have someone look at me like I was still worth something, not just a widow with 3 mouths to feed. When he suggested we take a weekend trip, I said yes before I even thought it through. That first flight felt like a miracle, like I was shaking off the shroud of grief, breathing again for the first time. But it was never supposed to swallow everything. I told myself it was just small treats, moments of light to keep from drowning. I told myself the money would last, that your father would have wanted me to be happy, that he would have wanted us to still see the world together. It sounds pathetic now, I see that. But it was so easy to let Alan handle the details. He always promised he'd sort it all out. And by the time I realized how far it had gone, I was too frightened and too ashamed to stop. I thought if I could just keep the secret long enough, somehow we'd recover and you'd never have to know. I convinced myself I was protecting you. A small strangled sound tore from Isabelle's throat. Protecting them. How many times had Marlene said that over the years, that everything she did was for the family, for their future, to keep them from becoming objects of pity in this little town? Isabelle wondered now if Marlene even knew the difference between love and fear, or if somewhere along the line they'd become hopelessly tangled in her mother's heart. I think the hardest thing to admit is that I was lonely. Your father filled every corner of this house with laughter and stories and plans. When he died, the house echoed. Even when you kids were around, there was a hole nothing could fill. Alan slipped into that space like water finding cracks. But loneliness is not an excuse for betrayal. I know that now. Every night in this cell, I lie awake thinking of you, of Thomas, of Emma. How I failed you. How I took your father's last gift and turned it into something ugly. I dream sometimes of you three running across the lawn in the sprinklers, your father waving from the porch. In those dreams, I feel like myself again. Then I wake up to bars and the smell of bleach and I remember who I am. I'm so sorry, Isabelle. More than words can hold. If I could give you back those years of struggle, I would. If I could pull every dollar from the ground and put it back into your hands, I would. I hope that one day you'll be able to remember me not just for my failings, but for the years before the years when I braided your hair and painted your room yellow because you said it felt like sunlight. Take care of each other, that's all I ask. I love you even if I no longer deserve your love in return. Mom? By the end, the words blurred entirely. Isabelle set the letter down on the table, pressing her palms flat against the cool wood to keep herself anchored. Tears fell silently, darkening the grain beneath her fingers. She wished fiercely that she could hate Marlene without complication, that the memory of bedtime stories of arms wrapped around her after skinned knees, of whispered reassurances during storms would just vanish so she could hold on to righteous fury. But love was stubborn. It clung to old promises even when every new fact argued against them. In the next room, her phone buzzed. A message from Thomas. Emma's coming over. We're picking up dinner. Want us to grab you something? Isabelle wiped at her eyes. Yes. Thai food okay? Perfect. Be there soon. Love you. She let out a long, shuddering breath, folded Marlene's letter carefully, almost tenderly, and tucked it into a small wooden box she kept on a shelf, an old jewelry case that had once belonged to her grandmother. Then she closed it, sealing grief and memory away for another day. Because for now all that mattered was Thomas and Emma, the three of them scarred but still standing, still choosing each other despite everything that had been stolen. And maybe that was the only redemption they would ever get, holding tighter to what was left, promising quietly in the dark to do better than the generation before. Isabelle turned off the kitchen light, letting dusk gather gently around her. The apartment felt calm, expectant. Soon there would be laughter again, shared takeout containers, Emma's bright voice telling some story from campus. It wasn't the family she'd once believed in, but it was real, hard-won and fragile, and for tonight, that was enough. The house looked smaller than Isabelle remembered. Maybe it was the wide, empty spaces where furniture used to sit, or the sunlight pouring through the bare windows without curtains to soften it. Or maybe grief itself had always made the place feel cavernous, each hallway an echo chamber of old laughter, and then later of muffled arguments behind closed doors. Now it was all reduced to cardboard boxes, stacks of bubble-wrapped frames, leaning against walls, piles of linens waiting to be hauled away. Thomas had pulled the old armchair onto the porch, saying he couldn't bear to see it leave on a stranger's truck. Emma was upstairs, rummaging through closets for anything they might have missed. Isabelle stood in the living room, hands stuffed into the pockets of her jeans, eyes sweeping over the worn hardwood floors. Every nick and scratch seemed to shimmer with memory. That one near the entryway, Thomas had carved it when he dragged in a Christmas tree that was way too big, needles scattering like confetti. The dark water stain by the fireplace, Emma spilled hot chocolate there at 11, sobbing, because she was sure Mom would be furious, only to be scooped up into gentle arms. For a moment, it nearly broke Isabelle. The fragile peace they'd built since the trial threatened to crack open under the weight of what they were doing now. Selling this house felt like gutting the last shared organ of their family, but she forced herself to breathe through it. Because they'd agreed this place was a monument to a story that had turned rotten long before they ever admitted it. Keeping it would mean chaining themselves to years of secrets and silent dinners of walking through rooms haunted by voices they could never again trust. Selling it was letting go, a hard mercy. Thomas pushed through the screen door, then cheeks ruddy from hauling boxes. "Hey, movers will be back tomorrow for the last load. Emma's boxing up the last of the photos. You okay?" "Yeah," Isabelle managed, her voice scratchy. "Just taking it in one last time." Thomas stepped beside her. His arm slipped around her shoulders, warm and steady. Isabelle leaned into it without thinking, fitting herself against her brother, the same way she had as a little girl hiding from thunderstorms. It grounded her in a way nothing else could. Emma appeared at the top of the stairs, a cardboard box hugged against her chest. Her face was red, but her eyes were clear. "I found Dad's old watch," she said, voice small. "It was in a shoebox under their bed. I'm glad it didn't get lost in everything else." Isabelle felt tears threaten again, but she blinked them back. "You should keep it." Emma nodded, clutching the box tighter. She came down the steps slowly, each footfall soft, as if she too was paying silent tribute to every creak and groan of these old floorboards. When she reached them, she tucked herself under Thomas's other arm. There they stood, three siblings side by side in the hollowed-out shell of their childhood. For all its emptiness, the space felt oddly tender now, like a wound finally scabbing over. The worst of it was behind them, the depositions, the courtroom stairs, the letters from prison full of apologies Isabelle wasn't ready to accept. Ahead was a question mark, but at least it was theirs to answer. Thomas exhaled a long breath, looking around with an almost wistful smile. "You know, it's weird. I thought I'd feel more destroyed by this, but honestly, I think I'm relieved." Emma swiped under her eyes with her sleeve. "Me too. I don't want to keep living in a museum of who we thought we were. I want something that's just ours, clean slate, no ghosts." Isabelle pressed her lips together, then nodded. "Exactly. And the sale gives us that. Gives you the chance to pay off the rest of your student loans, Thomas. Lets you finally launch your own shop. Gives Emma a cushion for grad school or wherever she decides to go next." Emma's eyes brightened, even damp as they were. "And what about you?" "I've already found a little place in Arcata." Isabelle confessed, a shy smile cracking through. "It's tiny, but it's near the coast. Light all day long. I want to open a studio there somewhere people can just wander in off the street. No pretensions, just art and space to breathe." Thomas let out a soft laugh. "You're really doing it. Dad would have loved that." Emma reached for Isabelle's hand, squeezing it hard. "He would have. And I think maybe he's the only piece of this house I really want to keep." Isabelle squeezed back. "Then we take him with us, in all the ways that matter." They stood there like that for another long minute, the three of them forming a kind of small, imperfect circle. Around them the house seemed to sigh, boards settling the air, shifting through empty vents, the quiet rustle of years lifting and drifting away. Finally, Thomas gave a gentle tug, pulling them both closer. "All right, you two, one last group hug for the road." They collapsed into each other's arms, winding tight heads, bumping breaths coming out in shaky little laughs. For a heartbeat, Isabelle let herself truly lean in, let herself be held by these two people who were the only remaining proof that the Torres family ever existed. "This is the beginning, not the end," Emma whispered fiercely, voice thick. "I promise." Isabelle swallowed the lump in her throat. "Yeah, the very beginning." When they pulled apart, Thomas ruffled both their hair with a grin that was too wide to be entirely steady. "All right, let's get out of here before we start sobbing on the new owner's doorstep." They grabbed the last of the boxes, light stuff, old blankets, a single cracked mug no one quite wanted to leave behind. Outside, the sun was just beginning to dip, painting the street in warm amber. As they loaded up Thomas's truck, Isabelle took one final look at the front porch, at the railing where she'd once tied birthday balloons, at the spot near the door where she'd first scraped her knee learning to ride a bike. Then she turned, climbed in, and didn't look back again. Because ahead was a coast town with salt in the air, a little studio waiting for her hand to cover its walls in color. Ahead were fresh pages, blank canvases, new chapters where love might finally mean security instead of secrecy, where family could just be family, no balances owed, no twisted debts hidden under the floorboards. The truck rumbled to life. Thomas reached over to clasp her shoulder. Emma beamed from the back seat. Isabelle smiled through tears that somehow felt sweeter than any she'd shed in years. They pulled away from the curb together, leaving the house and all its tangled ghosts small in the rearview mirror. And as they turned the corner, laughter began to bubble up between them, startled and bright and a little fragile but real. It was enough. It was everything. It was at last the start of something true. The first morning in their little rental by the coast, Isabelle woke before dawn, startled from sleep by a vivid dream, her father's laughter echoing through sunlit halls that didn't exist anymore. For a disoriented moment, she almost expected to find herself back in the Portland house, her old bedroom with the cracked windowsill and faint scent of lavender. But when she pushed herself up on her elbows, she saw only soft, salt-stained walls, painted a cheerful pale green. Through the cracked window drifted the low hush of waves rolling up from the ocean a few streets down. She let out a breath that trembled but didn't break. Then she smiled. Downstairs, Thomas was already clattering around in the kitchen. Isabelle found him by the tiny stove, squinting into a battered saucepan like it might reveal the mysteries of the universe. Trying to make oatmeal, he muttered when he saw her cheeks flushing. "But I think I made cement." She leaned over, sniffed, wrinkled her nose. "That's impressive. Didn't know oatmeal could smell like burnt tires." He huffed out a laugh, shutting off the burner. "You want to try rescuing it, or should we go full California cliché and walk down to that coffee shack on the beach for avocado toast?" "Avocado toast, obviously." Isabelle grinned, bumping his hip with hers. For a second he just looked at her, his eyes bright in the dim light, and then pulled her into a one-armed hug that squeezed the breath from her ribs. "I'm proud of you," he said, voice rough, "for dragging us here, for starting over." Isabelle pressed her forehead to his shoulder. "We did this together." "Yeah." He let her go, cleared his throat, busied himself wiping the counter. "And speaking of starting over, I've got my first day shadowing at the high school next week. They want me to sit in on some classes before officially handing me my own." She blinked. "You didn't tell me you were that close." Thomas shrugged, trying for casual but failing spectacularly. "I didn't want to jinx it, but they need a history teacher, and apparently I still know enough about old dead presidents to impress the principal." Isabelle felt her chest warm from the inside out. Her brother, who'd once given up on college because he thought there was no money, standing here in a tiny sunlit kitchen ready to start teaching. It was everything their parents had robbed him of finally curling back around to find him again. Emma tumbled down the stairs not long after, hair wild, barefoot, and blinking. I heard voices. "Are we making actual breakfast or going to let Isabelle poison us with cafe pastries?" "Excuse you," Isabelle sniffed. "My pastry selections are flawless. Besides, it's avocado toast day." "Oh, thank God." Emma dropped onto a stool, grinning. "Also, I got an email this morning. UC Santa Cruz accepted my transfer. I start in the fall." For a heartbeat, the kitchen was silent. Then Thomas whooped so loudly, Isabelle jumped. Emma squealed, ducking her head as he swept her up and spun her in a half circle that knocked into the fridge. "You're going to finish," Isabelle whispered, blinking fast. "You're going to get your degree in social work. Help kids who've been through hell like we did." Emma beamed at her eyes glossy. "That's the plan." That afternoon, the three of them walked down the narrow lane toward Isabelle's new studio. It was a tiny whitewashed building that used to house a bait shop perched on a bluff overlooking the churning Pacific. She'd spent the last week painting the interior a warm, dove gray, hanging string lights and scrubbing salt residue from the windows. The front door still stuck a little. When she pushed it open, a faint tang of fresh paint and ocean air rushed out to greet them. Thomas immediately moved to the far wall where her biggest canvas leaned, an abstract swirl of bruised purples and hopeful golds. "This is new. It's lighter." Isabelle's throat went tight. "Yeah, I think I'm finally painting like someone who believes tomorrow's going to be here." Emma crossed to the window. Sun spilled over her shoulders, catching the tear tracks still drying there. "This place feels like a heartbeat," she said softly. "Like you could just stand here forever and breathe." That night they had their first dinner in the tiny living room of the rental pizza, on paper plates, cheap wine in mismatched mugs. Thomas perched on an old beanbag that deflated dramatically under his weight. Emma sat cross-legged on the floor, legs bumping Isabelle's knees. They talked about everything and nothing. About Thomas's awkward handshake with the vice principal, who apparently had a limp goldfish in a bowl on her desk. About Emma's future practicum hours. About how Isabelle's landlord seemed permanently confused by the concept of gallery hours. And at some point, no one marked exactly when it stopped feeling like a borrowed space. It felt like home. Later, long after Emma and Thomas drifted off to their rooms, Isabelle stepped out onto the back deck. The ocean was a dark, restless sprawl, moonlight freckling it silver. She could hear laughter echoing faintly from another house down the block. Somewhere closer, wind chimes tangled out a fragile tune. She pressed her palms against the rough wood of the railing, let the salt whip across her face. It wasn't Portland. Wasn't that old house weighed down with secrets and debts and ghosts? Here there was only the night, the waves, and the small creak of the deck under her bare feet. A fragile peace settled in her chest. Not because everything was healed, she didn't fool herself. Their mother's letters still sat in a neat stack in her dresser, unopened since that first one. Sometimes at night she still startled awake, certain she heard Marlene calling her name, her voice lost and afraid. But she could breathe here, could watch her siblings unfold into new versions of themselves, Thomas guiding kids through lessons on the gold rush, Emma piecing together how to mend hearts fractured by neglect, could paint with colors that weren't always blood and bruise. And for the first time in years, Isabelle believed they'd all find a way to keep growing, scarred, maybe a little tender in the soft places, but together, choosing each other. Tomorrow she'd hang the open sign on the gallery door. Watch strangers wander in off the boardwalk, eyes bright with wonder. Tomorrow Thomas would prep his first actual syllabus. Emma would email her new advisor a list of volunteer sites. Tonight she let herself close her eyes, and when she did, she saw only the gentle curve of the coastline and the promise of morning. It was enough. It was everything. It was the slow, patient shape of healing, no longer a desperate scraping plea, but a quiet vow that they'd keep going together into every uncertain, hopeful dawn. Most evenings settled around them like a sigh, slow, unhurried, laced with the faint tang of salt on the breeze. The little house perched just a few blocks up from the sea, close enough for them to hear the waves rolling in and out, steady as a breath. Isabelle often said it felt like the entire ocean was sleeping outside their door, dreaming gentle dreams on their behalf. By this point, they'd all fallen into a quiet rhythm that felt almost miraculous in its simplicity. Each day unfolded without the dull dread that had once accompanied life under their mother's roof, or the acid weight of courtrooms and whispered accusations. Now there were only soft rituals, things that seemed small, until Isabelle realized how profoundly they healed. On the front porch, Isabelle had set up a battered easel that tilted slightly to the left no matter how many times she adjusted it. She loved it precisely because of that imperfection. Late afternoons, when the sun sank toward the water and turned the sky a deep honeyed rose, she'd bring out a jar of brushes and a small canvas. Sometimes she painted sweeping coastlines. Other days it was tangled abstracts, swirls of cobalt and burnt orange that seemed to pour directly from the warm ache in her chest. Thomas usually settled nearby with a thick novel balanced across one knee. His reading glasses an addition he still stubbornly refused to admit he needed slipped down his nose every few minutes, forcing him to nudge them back with an annoyed huff. But there was a softness to him now Isabelle hadn't seen since they were kids. The creases around his eyes had become laugh lines instead of scars. Whenever he flipped a page, his foot tapped gently on the porch rail in time to some private rhythm. Emma, meanwhile, had become the joyous sun at the center of their orbit. She'd convinced them without much struggle, if Isabelle was honest, to adopt a scruffy golden retriever pup from the local shelter. The dog, whom Emma named Gulliver for reasons none of them entirely understood, was all gawky legs and boundless enthusiasm. Most evenings, Emma ran around the tiny yard with Gulliver bounding after her, his floppy ears flying. Her laughter spiraled up into the branches overhead, startled birds taking wing like confetti. Isabelle would sometimes pause mid-stroke just to watch them, the way Emma bent over to bury her face in Gulliver's soft fur, the way Thomas's mouth curled at the edges whenever Emma squealed, the way light caught in Emma's hair, making it look almost like their mothers had once upon a time, before the weight of years and secrets had drained all the shine. It wasn't a grand life. There were still bills to pay, still moments when Thomas's teaching salary ran short and Isabelle's gallery had to stretch to cover little emergencies, like Gulliver's alarming tendency to chew through shoes that cost more than Isabelle's rent. Emma fretted constantly over student loan statements, even as Isabelle and Thomas reminded her the new trust arrangements from the lawsuit meant she wouldn't drown under them the way they once had. But none of that ever felt heavy. Not compared to the years they'd spent tiptoeing over cracked emotional ice. Here in this crooked little house by the sea, everything felt lighter. They teased each other without sharp edges, apologized when they slipped, took turns cooking disastrous dinners that ended in breathless laughter over burnt pans. Sometimes music spilled through the open windows, Emma's playlist drifting easily from mellow indie to soft acoustic covers of old classics. Isabelle painted with the notes fluttering around her. Gulliver sprawled at her feet, Thomas reading with a faint smile. The combination wove itself into something warm and whole that settled in Isabelle's bones. One Thursday evening, Isabelle looked up from her work just in time to see Thomas and Emma dancing. No music was playing. Emma had simply stood up from the porch step, grabbed Thomas's hand and started twirling him around. Gulliver barked in delight and tried to join in, leaping between them until they collapsed on the grass in a tangle of limbs and helpless laughter. Isabelle's throat went tight. For a second, she caught the ghost of her mother standing there too, Marlene as she'd once been with sun in her hair, and bright hope in her eyes before Alan, and deceit in all those long gray years. It was strange how that vision didn't fill Isabelle with the bitter acid it might have months ago. Instead, it just settled inside her with a kind of soft ache. They were building a family again, not because they needed a parent to bind them, certainly not because they wanted to replace the love that had fallen so disastrously apart, but simply because that was what people did, gathered close, tended small joys, mended wounds, not by forgetting, but by living around them until the scars became stories, not fresh breaks. Later that night, as Emma and Thomas cleaned up dinner dishes inside, Isabelle lingered on the porch. The ocean was a dusky slate color, now shadows pooling deep along the dunes. Gulliver pressed his warm side against Isabelle's shin-tail, thumping gently. She rested a hand on his head. She thought about how she used to believe family was a fragile glass-like thing, beautiful and sparkling, but liable to shatter if you looked at it wrong. That belief had kept her tiptoeing around truths for years, had made her accept too little question too late. But out here, under salt-kissed skies with a goofy dog leaning against her leg and her siblings laughing through the windows, she realized maybe family was something else entirely. Maybe it was more like the tide, sometimes violent, sometimes heartbreakingly gentle, but always coming back to meet the shore. Maybe it reshaped itself as many times as needed, smoothing over jagged places in small patient strokes. She leaned back in her chair and let her eyes fall closed. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she wasn't cataloging wounds or weighing grief against love. She simply existed, the low murmur of the sea promising tomorrow would arrive bright and vast and just uncertain enough to still be precious. Inside, Thomas laughed at something Emma said. Isabelle could hear plates clinking, the quick patter of Gulliver's paws on the tile. That was their music now, their small, miraculous, mundane symphony. And as she sat there, Isabelle felt something ease open inside her, something that whispered they'd not only survived, but somehow impossibly they'd begun to thrive. Not because they'd erased the past, not because they'd found some fairy tale forgiveness, but because they'd chosen this each other again and again in 100 tiny, tender ways. It wasn't the life she once imagined. It was better, it was real. And in the hush of that evening, surrounded by new memories already forming like soft buds, Isabelle finally understood that healing didn't mean erasing the scars. It meant loving yourself and the people beside you enough to keep growing even around the breaks. The story of the Torres family didn't quietly slip away into private memory. It detonated across small-town Oregon like a firecracker tossed into dry brush. Isabelle always suspected it would, though she'd hoped naively that perhaps people would lose interest after the court dates ended. But scandal had a way of sticking, especially when it wore the comfortable skin of people everyone thought they knew. Marlene's sentencing took place on a Wednesday morning that dawned curiously bright sun, gilding the courthouse steps like a stage light. Isabelle, Thomas, and Emma sat together on a hard wooden bench as the judge laid it all out: 5 years probation with stringent reporting requirements, plus mandatory financial restitution of the remaining trust funds. If Marlene missed a payment or failed to show up for her monthly compliance checks, the suspended sentence could snap into a real prison term instantly. The courtroom was half full, faces familiar and not, former neighbors, old church acquaintances, a couple of local reporters with notepads poised like vultures hungry for the next vivid pull quote. When the gavel fell, Marlene's shoulders sagged so deeply Isabelle wondered if she might simply fold in on herself and vanish. But she didn't. She was escorted out by her attorney, her eyes downcast, mouth pulled taut in a thin, brittle line. Alan's fate was grimmer. His separate trial concluded weeks later, the verdict a swift collision with reality, guilty of aggravated assault, stemming from the incident on that rainy night, plus charges tied to financial manipulation that prosecutors argued rose to a pattern of coercive control over Marlene's decisions. He received 2 years in state prison. When the sentence was read, Alan didn't flinch. He just adjusted his expensive cufflinks, a strange, absurd gesture given his imminent future in an orange jumpsuit, and smirked like a man who still believed the world owed him something. The papers, of course, devoured it all. The local journal ran a spread titled "Behind the White Picket Fence: How a Beloved Widow and Her Late Husband's Best Friend Stole $500,000 from Her Own Children." Another regional magazine took a tack that made Isabelle's stomach turn, splashing her mother's youthful portrait alongside Alan's business headshot, under the garish caption "Love Lies and Luxury Vacations." Even national outlets sniffed around, intrigued by the lurid shape of the story. Betrayal draped in familiar suburban trappings, a once charming craftsman home with flower boxes under the windows, hiding rot at its very foundation. For weeks, social media fed on their lives like flies. Isabelle stopped opening Facebook after reading one too many strangers call them gullible brats who should have known better. Others were weirdly sympathetic to Marlene, pushing maudlin narratives of a lonely widow duped by a charming friend. Neither felt true. Neither captured the sharp, tangled reality Isabelle carried in her chest. Meanwhile, back in this old Portland neighborhood, the shockwaves cracked through every polite sidewalk conversation. Mrs. Ramirez, who once brought over flan during Emma's dance recitals, was overheard at the grocery store telling someone how that poor Marlene just snapped under grief, bless her heart. Isabelle would later learn Mrs. Sanderson across the street was less charitable, calling them that whole sneaky lot, shaking her head as if the children were accomplices instead of collateral damage. Sometimes Emma got texts from old classmates, thinly veiled fishing expeditions masked as concern. "Hey girl, just saw the news. Is it really true your mom stole all that money? Crazy, right? Hope you're okay." Emma would show them to Isabelle and Thomas, rolling her eyes with a brittle little laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "They just want fresh gossip for their group chats," she'd say, then toss her phone aside and bury herself under Gulliver's happy, oblivious weight. Thomas handled it differently. He'd grit his teeth, pour himself another cup of coffee, and dive into lesson plans until the noise of it all faded into background static. Once, when he ran into an old friend from high school who blurted out, "Man, your family was always so perfect, nobody had a clue." Thomas just gave a tight smile and said, "Guess we fooled you as well as we fooled ourselves." Then he walked off, leaving the man spluttering in awkward silence. For Isabelle, the scrutiny felt like a constant low-grade fever. Sometimes people whispered a little too loudly when she walked into the local art supply shop. Sometimes they fell strangely silent, guilty, embarrassed, like her very presence reminded them the world was more fragile than they wanted to believe. But more often there was a kind of pity that stung sharper than outright judgment. A woman at the farmer's market who probably meant well reached across a display of peaches to pat Isabelle's hand. "You're so brave, dear. What a terrible thing for your mother to do. I don't know how you can still smile." Isabelle had smiled then too reflexively, but inside she felt scraped raw. Because what was the alternative? Live out the rest of her years as a silent monument to someone else's sins? Gradually, though, even this prying curiosity began to ebb. New scandals arose, new tragedies, new little triumphs and heartbreaks to monopolize the community's limited appetite for drama. The Torres story faded first from front pages, then from gossip brunches, until it was just another cautionary tale that came up occasionally over coffee. Remember that woman who stole from her own kids wild, pass the sugar. In that vacuum of public attention, something surprising sprouted for Isabelle, Thomas, and Emma, the quiet space needed to keep healing, the distance to define themselves by their own choices, not by the headlines that once reduced them to cautionary footnotes. Still, there were lingering aftershocks. Sometimes Emma would freeze at the sound of a phone notification, a reflex left over from all those courthouse schedule texts. Sometimes Thomas would wake in the middle of the night and pace shoulders tight, only relaxing after he peeked into Emma's room or knocked softly on Isabelle's door to be sure everyone was still there, still safe. Isabelle felt it most when she painted. Certain brushstrokes, certain color palettes still pulled up old bruises, deep stormy purples that reminded her of sleepless nights, trying to balance debt on a hope and a lie. Soft pinks that felt like the fragile warmth of her mother's lullabies before everything broke. But she kept painting, kept filling her studio walls with chaotic beauty, stubborn proof that she and her siblings were building lives no longer anchored to the betrayal that had almost swallowed them. One morning, months after Marlene's sentencing, a local feature ran in the art section of the paper. It highlighted Isabelle's gallery as a fresh, soulful addition to the coastal community. The reporter snapped photos of her beside her canvases of Thomas, sitting on a bench outside grading papers, of Emma chasing Gulliver across the sand. The piece only brushed the old scandal, focusing instead on how the Torres siblings have transformed past hardship into a new chapter defined by resilience, creativity, and quiet mutual devotion. When Isabelle read it over breakfast, Emma squeezed her hand and whispered, "That's who we are now, that's all that matters." Thomas just nodded, a small, proud smile carving through the scruff on his jaw. "Let them see this part of the story. It's the only part we can write." And for the first time since everything unraveled, Isabelle truly believed him. Let them talk if they still needed to. Let them point or pity or misunderstand. Because behind all those curious stares, the three of them were still here, rebuilding, loving, daring to dream beyond the wreckage. And that in the tender hush of their new mornings by the sea was more than enough. They chose a small cafe with tables on a shaded wooden deck overlooking the dunes, far enough from town that it wouldn't invite curious eyes. Isabelle arrived first, her stomach tight with a complicated tangle of dread and something like fragile hope. Thomas came next, his hand firm on Emma's shoulder as if guiding her forward by sheer will. They sat together at a table painted robin's egg blue with small chips in the corners where salt air had started its patient erosion. Isabelle ordered a pot of herbal tea they'd probably barely touch. They were still waiting when Marlene appeared, thin, almost gaunt, wearing a pale cardigan despite the mild weather. The breeze lifted her hair, now streaked almost entirely with silver. For a long moment she stood at the edge of the deck, as if testing the ground, eyes darting from one child to the next. When she finally stepped up, her hands were clasped so tightly the knuckles glowed white. "Thank you for meeting me," she said, voice low and strained. I know you didn't have to, truly." No one spoke. Thomas's jaw worked as if he was biting back 1,000 thoughts. Emma kept her gaze on her lap thumb, skimming over her phone's lock button again and again, though the screen stayed dark. Marlene pulled out the remaining chair with a small, awkward motion. When she sat, her shoulders hunched as though trying to make herself smaller. "I've written so many letters," she began, swallowing hard. "Most I didn't send. I didn't know if it would make things worse or if you'd even open them." Her eyes flicked to Isabelle, soft and wounded. Isabelle offered no help. She couldn't. The past months had taught her how to live with her scars, but forgiveness was another country entirely, one she hadn't yet found the road to. "I want to say how sorry I am," Marlene continued, voice trembling. "Not just for the money, though, that was terrible enough. But for letting Alan so close, for putting him ahead of you three, for every time I told myself a lie, that made it easier to keep taking." Emma drew a shaky breath, but still didn't look up. Thomas reached across to rest a hand over hers, grounding her. "I was lonely," Marlene whispered, "but that doesn't excuse anything. I should have leaned on you three for love, not stolen from your futures to feed my fears. I see that now. Every night I see it, and it breaks me a little more." Silence hovered over the table. Waves crashed somewhere beyond the dunes. A seagull called overhead, sharp and oddly discordant. Marlene's shoulders slumped deeper. "I'm trying to make amends. I know I can't repay all of it, not truly, but I'm working, and everything I earn after basic expenses goes toward restitution. It's slow, it's humiliating, but it's what I can do." Isabelle stared at the teapot, watching steam curl upward in soft ghosts. Her heart hurt in ways she couldn't name. Part of her wanted to reach across the table to find her mother's hand, to cling to some memory of the woman who'd once brushed her hair by lamplight, and whispered, "Hush, baby. It's just thunder." Another part wanted to turn away forever to protect this fragile new life they'd built without her. Thomas cleared his throat. When he spoke, it was rough, tired but not cruel. "We see you're trying, we do, but you broke more than just trust funds, Mom. You broke something in us that's going to take years, maybe the rest of our lives to fix." Emma finally lifted her gaze. Tears clung to her lashes. "We're okay, we really are now. We have each other. We're learning to stand on our own, but I don't know when I'll be ready to let you all the way back in. Maybe not for a long time." A shiver ran through Marlene. She knotted her mouth, pressing tight as if to hold back a sob. "I understand. Truly. I just needed you to hear me say it, how sorry I am, and how much I still love you, even if you can't ever feel the same again." The table seemed to shrink under the weight of that confession. Isabelle's chest tightened painfully. Her hand drifted to her pendant, a small sun disk she'd started wearing right after the move, a reminder to look forward instead of back. She held it, thumb brushing the smooth surface. When she finally spoke, it was almost a whisper. "We don't hate you, Mom." Marlene flinched, blinking rapidly. "But it's going to take time, so much time to rebuild. Even a shadow of trust." Isabelle continued, her voice strengthening with each word. "And we have to do it at our pace, not yours. You need to respect that." Tears slid down Marlene's face then. She didn't try to wipe them away. "I will, however long it takes. I'll wait. I'll keep proving it, even if it's only from a distance." They all sat there for a few minutes longer. No one reached across the table, no warm reunion unfolded. But neither did they get up and leave in anger. It was fragile, uncomfortable, but undeniably real, a first step maybe. Or at least the clearing of ground where something new might grow someday, if tended carefully enough. Eventually Thomas stood brushing off his jeans. "We should head back. Emma has a volunteer shift tonight, and I promised to help Isabelle load canvases for her show." Marlene nodded, her chin trembling. "Of course, thank you for this. It's more than I deserve." They left without hugging, without promises of immediate visits or family dinners. But as Isabelle stepped off the deck, she turned back, met her mother's eyes across the space of that painted wooden table, and gave the smallest of nods. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was a thread, frail, almost invisible, that might one day weave into something stronger. As they walked back toward the car, Emma slipped her arm through Isabelle's, pressing close. Thomas fell into step on Isabelle's other side, his hand brushing her back. Together they moved forward down the sun-dappled street, Gulliver racing ahead to chase shadows on the warm pavement. It struck Isabelle then, they were still writing this story, all of them, even Marlene from her lonely corner. And though the chapters ahead would be hard, complicated, stitched with cautious lines instead of bold declarations, they would keep turning the pages together, slowly, carefully, with hearts that somehow, despite everything, still dared to hope. By the time they pulled into the little gravel driveway, the sun had dropped low enough to set the world ablaze. It turned the sky over their small coastal street into a canvas of molten orange and blush pink, trailing gold across every rooftop. The ocean just beyond their neighborhood seemed to catch fire with its shimmering and fractured jewels all the way to the horizon. Isabelle killed the engine, and for a moment they all just sat there, windows cracked, listening to the hush of waves tangled with the soft rattle of wind through eucalyptus. Thomas leaned forward on the console, resting his forehead on his crossed arms. Emma chewed her lip, one hand absent-mindedly tangled in Gulliver's scruff where the dog panted happily across her lap. Isabelle let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. It seemed like she'd been doing that for months, clenching herself tight against everything that threatened to break her open. Against their mother's sorrowful letters, against neighbors' pointed whispers, against her own guilty longing for a past that never truly existed. She turned off the key and reached back to stroke Gulliver's silky ear. "All right, family meeting," she said, voice gentle but teasing. "Everyone out, we're home." The porch light flicked on automatically as they climbed the steps, chasing away the first hints of dusk. Gulliver dashed ahead, nails clicking excitedly on the board's nose, already pressed to the bottom of the door like he might shove it open himself. Emma laughed, a bright, breathless sound that carved Isabelle's heart wide open with relief. Thomas unlocked the door and shouldered it inward. The familiar scent of paint and salt and something faintly citrus greeted them, wrapping around Isabelle like the softest shawl. She stepped inside last, closing the door carefully behind her, the latch clicking into place with a satisfying certainty. For a moment, none of them moved. They stood in the entryway, just listening to Gulliver's paws scrambling across the living room rug, to the distant hollow boom of waves rolling into each other's breathing, light and uneven. Then Isabelle looked over at her brother and sister and felt something tender and electric bloom behind her ribs. She didn't bother to stop the smile that spread across her face. It was too big, too luminous, as if every quiet hope she'd harbored finally burst to the surface. "You know what she said?" voice catching just a little. "This is it, right here. This is where our family starts again." Emma made a small sound, half laugh, half choked sob, and flung her arms around Isabelle's neck. Thomas wrapped them both up in his longer arms, pulling them tight against his chest. Isabelle closed her eyes and breathed them in the hint of Emma's shampoo, the laundry soap on Thomas's collar, the dusty, sun-warmed scent of the house that was no longer just walls and beams but a living testament to their choosing each other again and again. After a minute, they broke apart. Emma wiped at her eyes and tried to play it off with a grin. "Okay, but if we're officially starting fresh, I get to vote for ordering obscene amounts of pizza tonight. And ice cream. We can have an emotional rebirth over cookie dough, right?" Thomas snorted. "That's probably the only acceptable way to do it." Isabelle laughed, the sound bubbling up effortless and bright. "Done, but only if you both promise to help me haul out that new canvas tomorrow. It's enormous, and I want to start it with the windows open. Let this whole place smell like turpentine and salt air. Deal, Thomas said, slinging an arm around her shoulders. Double deal! Emma chimed, hooking her arm through Isabelle's free side. Gulliver barked, circling them once with frantic glee before dashing off toward the kitchen, likely in search of a forgotten snack. Later, while they waited on delivery, they all piled out onto the back deck. The three of them settled in close on an old bench cushion, legs tangled, shoulders pressed together. Gulliver flopped dramatically at their feet, rolling onto his back to offer his belly for absent-minded scratches. The sun was nearly gone now, leaving behind long lavender streaks that deepened into velvet blue. Below, the ocean rolled endlessly toward the shore, waves folding over each other with a low, hypnotic power. Each crash seemed to whisper away another piece of old pain, sanding down the jagged edges of every memory that had once sliced so deep. For the first time, Isabelle didn't tense at the thought of what had been lost. She didn't brace herself for guilt or shame or secondhand echoes of her mother's voice. Instead, she let the peace of this small moment soak into her skin, the hush of evening, the rhythmic sigh of the sea, Emma's head warm against her shoulder, Thomas's steady hand resting on her knee. Maybe this was all life really promised, anyone's small, incandescent spaces carved out of chaos, strung together by the fierce choice to stay, to care, to keep showing up for one another, even when it was easier to hide. She felt Thomas shift beside her. Remember when we thought we needed that old house to hold us together, he asked quietly. Yeah, Isabelle said, smiling faintly at the irony. Turns out we just needed us. Emma nudged her knee, and Gulliver, obviously. Emotional support icon. The dog let out a snuffling sigh as if in agreement, tail thumping once against Isabelle's ankle. When the pizza finally arrived, they carried it inside and spread it across the coffee table in the living room. They ate cross-legged on the floor plates, balanced on knees, sauce dripping onto napkins that quickly grew translucent with grease. The TV played some gentle slice-of-life cooking show none of them paid real attention to. Every so often, one of them would start laughing at nothing at all, as if the relief of it all, of simply being okay, kept spilling over. Eventually, Emma dozed off her head in Isabelle's lap, one hand tangled absently in Gulliver's fur. Thomas reclined back on an elbow, eyes half-lidded, a rare, unguarded contentment softening his features. Isabelle smoothed a lock of Emma's hair behind her ear and let her gaze drift to the window. Outside, the moon had risen, silvering the tops of the waves. The little house seemed to glow from within, a warm beacon against the dark. And though she knew scars still ran deep, knew they'd always be relearning how to trust, how to forgive, even how to let joy be uncomplicated, she felt sure of one thing. They'd begun again, on their own terms, with honest laughter, messy art, clumsy dancing, salt-sticky sunsets, and more gentle mornings than they ever thought they'd earn. And that Isabelle thought pressing her cheek to the top of Emma's head as her sister snuffled in her sleep was more than enough. More than she'd ever dared hope for on the nights grief made her believe she might never breathe freely again. The camera of life seemed to pull back then, as if granting them a private distance. Isabelle could almost imagine it, some quiet observer drawing slowly away, leaving them framed by the windows of this small miracle of a home. The laughter faded into music, soft lilting, almost like the sea itself had learned a new song. Outside, the waves kept rolling in, folding over themselves with patient grace, as if washing away all that had come before, making room for stories yet to be written. And somewhere deep inside Isabelle's heart answered that hush with its own fragile vow that whatever came next, they would meet it together, bruised, mending, and unbreakably whole.